Don't trust easily. Here's what it reveals about your shadow. Carl Jung. Your inability to trust isn't protecting you. It's confessing the darkest truth about your unconscious mind that Carl Jung spent decades trying to warn us about. Jung made a discovery so unsettling that even his closest colleagues struggled to accept it. The people who can't trust others aren't the wise ones who've learned caution through experience. They're the ones unconsciously carrying the heaviest shadow material, the rejected parts of themselves capable of profound betrayal, manipulation, and cruelty. Every person you refuse to trust is holding up a mirror, and the face staring back at you from that mirror, it's yours. This isn't another self-help platitude about how hurt people, or how your past trauma made you cautious. Jung's discovery cuts far deeper and far more uncomfortably than that. He found that your distrust of others is actually a confession, an unconscious admission of capacities within yourself that you've violently disowned and can't bear to acknowledge. The manipulator you see in your partner, that's your own strategic intelligence you've labeled as evil. The liar you detect in every conversation, that's your own capacity for necessary deception you've morally condemned. The abandoner you're convinced will eventually leave, that's the part of you that already abandoned yourself during your earliest wound. Jung called this phenomenon projection, but that clinical term doesn't capture the existential horror of what's actually happening. You're not just seeing your shadow in others. You're actively creating a reality where no one can ever be trustworthy because you're unconsciously ensuring that the very qualities you've rejected in yourself remain everywhere around you, confirming your darkest beliefs about human nature. Here's what makes this so devastating. Your hypervigilance isn't keeping you safe. Your constant testing of others' loyalty isn't revealing their true character. Your refusal to be vulnerable isn't protecting your heart. All of it, every single defense mechanism you've built around trust, is actually a prison guard keeping you locked away from the shadow material that holds your power, your wisdom, and your capacity for genuine discernment. Jung spent years working with patients who came to him convinced the world was full of untrustworthy people. Through dream analysis, active imagination, and the painstaking work of shadow integration, he discovered something that should terrify and liberate us in equal measure. The people who struggle most with trust aren't victims of a cruel world. They're unconscious perpetrators of the very betrayals they fear most. But the betrayal is directed inward at themselves and then projected outward onto everyone else. Let me be more specific about what Jung actually found, because this gets to the core of why your trust issues aren't what you think they are. When Jung analyzed the dreams of patients with severe trust wounds, he consistently found recurring shadow figures: the deceiver, the betrayer, the manipulator, the abandoner. These weren't symbols of people who had hurt them. These were personifications of disowned aspects of the dreamer's own psyche. One patient, we'll call her Anna, came to Jung convinced her husband was having an affair. She had no evidence, but she just knew. She checked his phone, followed him, created elaborate tests of his loyalty. The marriage was collapsing under the weight of her suspicion. Jung's dream analysis revealed the truth. Anna possessed an extraordinary capacity for strategic deception that she'd completely dissociated after a strict religious upbringing that equated any form of social maneuvering with sin. In her dreams, a beautiful dark-haired woman repeatedly appeared, charming, cunning, orchestrating social situations with brilliant precision. This wasn't a prophetic vision of her husband's mistress. This was Anna's own rejected feminine intelligence, her capacity for necessary social strategy, her ability to read situations and act accordingly, her gift for knowing when to reveal and when to conceal. She'd labeled this entire dimension of human intelligence as manipulation and expelled it from her conscious identity. But the psyche doesn't simply eliminate what we reject. It buries it in the shadow, where it gains autonomous power and begins to control us through projection. Anna couldn't trust her husband because she couldn't trust herself. More accurately, she couldn't consciously own that she herself was capable of the exact strategic thinking she accused him of planning. The breakthrough came when Jung had Anna embody the dark-haired woman in active imagination, to speak as her, to own her perspective, to consciously acknowledge, yes, I am capable of deception. Yes, I can read people and adjust my presentation. Yes, I am strategic in relationships. The moment Anna integrated this shadow material, her paranoia about her husband evaporated, not because she became naive, but because she developed genuine discernment. She could now identify real deception because she understood it from the inside, not as a moral evil, but as a human capacity that everyone possesses and uses in varying degrees. This is Jung's radical claim that most people aren't ready to hear. Your inability to trust others is directly proportional to the shadow material you've rejected about your own nature. The more violently you've disowned your capacity for betrayal, manipulation, and self-protection through deception, the more you'll see these qualities everywhere around you. Your psyche is desperately trying to show you what you've lost, but instead of recognizing it as yours, you experience it as a hostile external world that can never be trusted. Jung went even further with this insight, and here's where it gets truly uncomfortable. He claimed that paranoia, in its subclinical forms, that millions of people live with every day, isn't primarily a fear response to past trauma. It's a defense mechanism protecting you from the terrifying recognition of your own shadow's power. Think about that for a moment. Your distrust protects you not from dangerous people out there, but from the unbearable knowledge that you yourself contain everything you fear. The betrayer, the manipulator, the one who could hurt those who love you, the one who could abandon someone in their moment of need. These capacities aren't theoretical. They're actual potentials within your psyche, and the more desperately you deny them, the more your unconscious will project them onto others to force you to deal with them. This is why trust wound healing is never about learning to trust again through positive affirmations or exposure therapy. Those approaches treat the symptom while leaving the cause, the unintegrated shadow, completely intact. Real healing requires something far more courageous and far more uncomfortable. You have to consciously own the betrayer within. You have to integrate the manipulator. You have to acknowledge that you, yes, you, are capable of every form of dishonesty and strategic deception that you condemn in others, not because you're a bad person, but because you're a complete person, and completeness includes the shadow. Jung's warning was clear. Until you reclaim these projected elements, you will remain imprisoned in a reality where genuine trust is structurally impossible. You'll cycle through relationships where people eventually reveal their true colors, not because they change, but because your projection needs them to confirm your worst fears. You'll create tests that no one can pass because the tests aren't designed to discover trustworthiness. They're designed to protect your ego from the shadow integration work that would actually set you free. You'll live in a self-created hell where loneliness masquerades as wisdom, where isolation poses as strength, where the inability to connect deeply with another human being gets reframed as just being realistic about human nature. But there's another path. Jung mapped it completely. He walked it himself, and he left detailed instructions for those brave enough to follow. The journey begins with the most difficult admission you'll ever make. The person you can't trust isn't out there. They're staring back at you from every mirror you've been avoiding, and until you turn to face them, you'll never be free. Jung identified a specific psychological constellation that he witnessed repeatedly in his practice, a pattern so distinct and so devastating that it deserves its own diagnostic framework. He called it the Trustwound syndrome, though that term never appears in his published works, because he knew the medical establishment wasn't ready to accept that trust issues aren't just symptoms of other conditions. They're a complete personality organization built around shadow, rejection. Let me map this syndrome with clinical precision so you can identify whether you're caught in its grip. The Trustwound syndrome has a specific architecture, a way of structuring reality that feels protective but actually functions as a prison. At its core is a fundamental equation that the unconscious has accepted as absolute truth. Vulnerability / guaranteed betrayal. This isn't a conscious belief. If you ask someone with Trustwound syndrome whether they think being vulnerable inevitably leads to betrayal, they'd probably say no. They'd tell you they're just cautious or realistic or learning from experience. But watch their behavior, track their patterns, listen to their dreams. The unconscious has made a non-negotiable decision. Opening up equals certain destruction, and once that equation is established, everything else follows with mathematical inevitability. Symptom cluster 1, the evidence complex. People with Trustwound syndrome develop what Jung would call an evidentiary obsession. They can't simply receive love, loyalty, or honesty at face value. Everything must be proven, tested, verified, cross-examined. A partner says, "I love you," and instead of receiving it, the Trustwound syndrome sufferer immediately begins gathering evidence. What's their tone? What's their body language? What do they stand to gain by saying this? Is this manipulation? A friend offers help and the automatic response is suspicion. What do they want in return? What's their real agenda? Why would they do this unless they need something from me? Even kindness from strangers triggers the evidence complex. What are they trying to sell me? What's their angle? Nobody does something for nothing. This isn't healthy discernment. Jung was clear about the difference. Discernment is the mature capacity to read situations accurately and respond appropriately. It includes the ability to receive genuine care when it's offered, to trust appropriate people in appropriate contexts, to believe in good faith until evidence suggests otherwise. The evidence complex inverts this completely. It assumes bad faith as the default and requires extraordinary proof to override that assumption. And here's the trap. No amount of evidence is ever sufficient because the unconscious has already decided the verdict. This is exhausting for everyone involved, but especially for the person trapped in the pattern. They're conducting constant trials in their mind, prosecuting everyone around them for crimes that haven't been committed yet. Symptom cluster 2, the testing architecture. Jung observed that Trustwound syndrome sufferers develop elaborate testing systems, often entirely unconscious, designed to reveal people's true nature. These tests take many forms. The loyalty test, creating situations where the other person must choose between competing loyalties to see who they'll prioritize. The consistency test, watching for any discrepancy between what someone says and what they do, treating minor inconsistencies as proof of fundamental deception. The emergency test, inventing or amplifying crises to see if people will show up, then resenting them if they do for having ulterior motives, or if they don't for confirming betrayal. The confession test, sharing something vulnerable and watching carefully to see if it gets used against you later, and interpreting any reference to it as weaponization. The most insidious aspect of this testing architecture is that it creates unfalsifiable hypotheses. If someone passes the test, they must have been smart enough to hide their true nature. If they fail, it confirms they were never trustworthy. Jung called this the double bind of projection. The shadow material you've rejected sets up a psychological game where no outcome can disprove your core belief. You've created a closed system that protects itself from contradictory evidence. Symptom Cluster 3, the self-fulfilling prophecy pattern. Here's where trust wound syndrome becomes truly tragic. Your distrust actively creates the betrayals you fear. Jung documented this pattern meticulously. He watched patients push away genuine love through constant suspicion until the other person finally gave up. He observed how relentless testing eventually provoked the exact dishonesty or withdrawal it claimed to be detecting. The psychological mechanism is straightforward. When you treat someone as untrustworthy, they begin to experience the futility of trying to prove otherwise. Some will leave. Others will actually start hiding things, not because they're malicious, but because the environment of surveillance makes authentic communication impossible. Think about this. If someone is monitoring your every word for signs of deception, reading malicious intent into your facial expressions, testing your loyalty through manufactured scenarios, how long before you start withholding the full truth just to avoid another interrogation? The trust wound syndrome sufferer then points to this withholding as proof that their distrust was justified all along. They never recognized their own role in creating the exact dynamic they feared. This is the self-fulfilling prophecy loop that Jung warned would destroy any possibility of genuine relationship. You can't build intimacy in an atmosphere of prosecution. You can't create safety through constant testing. You can't receive love through suspicion. But the trust wound syndrome convinces you that these very tactics are what keep you safe. The 3 personality patterns within trust wound syndrome. Jung identified 3 distinct manifestations, 3 ways the archetype of distrust organizes personality. Pattern 1, the perpetual victim. These individuals have organized their identity around being betrayed. Every relationship eventually confirms their core narrative. Everyone leaves. People always disappoint. I should have known better than to trust. The shadow material here is fascinating. The perpetual victim has completely disowned their own capacity for agency and boundary setting. They've rejected the warrior archetype, the part of themselves that can say no, that can leave first, that can protect itself through action rather than passive suffering. By projecting all agency onto others, they ensure they'll always be in the victim position. Their unconscious actively selects people who will betray them because that's the only role they know how to play. Pattern 2. The fortress guardian. This pattern builds impenetrable walls and calls it strength. They pride themselves on not needing anyone, on being completely self-sufficient, on having learned their lesson about depending on others. The shadow material they've rejected is the vulnerable child, the part that actually needs connection, that craves intimacy, that wants to be seen and held and loved. They've labeled these needs as weakness and expelled them from consciousness. But the vulnerable child doesn't disappear. It gets projected onto everyone else, who are then seen as needy, dependent, or emotionally immature. The fortress guardian can't recognize that their contempt for others' vulnerability is actually contempt for their own disowned needs. Pattern 3, the strategic tester. These are the most unconsciously cunning of the 3 patterns. They don't overtly push people away or build walls. Instead, they create elaborate systems of tests disguised as normal relationship progression. If they really loved me, they would, becomes the operating principle. The bar for proof keeps rising. Nothing is ever quite sufficient to override the underlying doubt. The shadow material here is the judge and executioner archetype, the part of themselves that's harsh, condemning, impossible to please. They've projected this inner critic onto themselves in the form of other people who must be tested, but the real judgment is coming from within. What makes this pattern so painful is that these individuals genuinely believe they want intimacy. They think their testing is the path to finally feeling safe enough to connect. They don't realize that the testing itself is the shadow's way of ensuring connection never happens. The autoimmune disease metaphor. Jung used medical metaphors carefully, but this one captures the essence of Trustwound syndrome perfectly. Your psychological defense system has turned against you. In an autoimmune disease, the body's immune system mistakes healthy tissue for a threat and attacks it. In Trustwound syndrome, your trust defense system mistakes genuine connection for danger and destroys it. The very mechanisms that should protect you from real threats have become hyperactivated and indiscriminate. They can't differentiate between actual betrayal and healthy intimacy. Everything registers as potentially dangerous, so everything must be defended against. The result is a kind of psychological isolation that masquerades as safety. You've protected yourself so thoroughly that nothing can reach you. Not harm, but also not healing. Not betrayal, but also not love. Jung was clear about the prognosis for untreated Trustwound syndrome: progressive isolation leading to personality rigidity, chronic depression, and eventual spiritual death. The person remains technically alive, but has sealed themselves off from the very experiences that make life worth living. The tragedy is that sufferers often feel proud of their condition. They've reframed trust wounds as wisdom, paranoia as intelligence, isolation as strength. They look at people who trust easily and feel superior. They're naive. They haven't learned what I've learned. They'll get hurt, but I won't because I know better. But Jung's question cuts through this defensive pride. What's the point of never getting hurt if you also never get loved? What's the victory in never being betrayed if you also never truly connect? What kind of life is it where you've successfully protected yourself from everything, including meaning, joy, and authentic encounter? The Trustwound syndrome isn't wisdom. It's a prison cell that you've decorated and called home. And the shadow material you've rejected, your own capacity for betrayal, manipulation, and strategic self-protection, holds the key to your cell. But you'll never turn that key until you're willing to admit something that terrifies you more than any external betrayal ever could. The person you trusted least was always yourself. And until you reclaim that rejected capacity to be untrustworthy, to consciously own it, integrate it, and transmute it into genuine discernment, you'll remain locked in a reality where everyone else must carry your shadow for you. The symptoms you've just read aren't signs that you're broken. They're symptoms that your shadow is trying desperately to get your attention. The question is, are you finally ready to listen? In the summer of 1921, a woman Jung would later refer to as Maria in his private case, notes entered his consulting room with a leather notebook filled with names, dates, and documented evidence. She was 34 years old, unmarried despite several broken engagements, and absolutely certain that she'd uncovered a conspiracy. Her husband-to-be was having an affair. Her colleagues at the university library where she worked were spreading rumors about her. Her younger sister was manipulating their elderly mother against her. Even her priest, she'd concluded, was subtly undermining her faith through carefully chosen sermon topics that seemed designed specifically to attack her. Maria didn't present as clinically paranoid. She was articulate, intelligent, methodical. She'd brought evidence, receipts, letters, a detailed timeline of suspicious behaviors. She wanted Jung to confirm what she already knew, that she was surrounded by people who wore masks of care while secretly working to undermine her. Jung listened without judgment for 3 sessions, letting Maria present her case like a prosecutor, laying out evidence before a jury. Then he asked her a question that changed everything. Maria, tell me about the parts of yourself you most despise. She looked confused. This wasn't what she'd come for. She didn't have parts of herself she despised. She was, if anything, too trusting, too willing to see the best in people, which was exactly why they were able to deceive her so easily. Jung pressed gently, "If you could remove something from your own character, what would it be?" Maria thought for a long moment. Then, quietly, "I wish I wasn't so aware. I see things. I notice patterns in people's behavior, inconsistencies in their stories. I can predict what someone will do before they do it. And I hate that about myself. It feels manipulative, like I'm playing chess with people instead of just being genuine." There it was. Jung recognized immediately what he was dealing with, a brilliant strategic intelligence that had been morally condemned and expelled into the shadow where it had become autonomous and paranoid. Maria possessed an extraordinary gift for reading social dynamics, for understanding behavioral patterns, for predicting how people would act in given situations. In another context, this would have made her an exceptional diplomat, therapist, or strategist. But Maria had been raised in a strict Protestant household where any form of social calculation was equated with sin. Pure hearts don't analyze people, her mother had taught her. If you're truly good, you take people at face value. So Maria had done what Jung saw many patients do. She'd taken a native capacity, in this case, social and psychological intelligence, and labeled it as evil. She'd tried to expunge it from her conscious personality. But the psyche doesn't work that way. What you reject doesn't disappear. It descends into the unconscious, where it continues to operate, but now without your conscious oversight or ethical integration. It becomes a splinter personality, an autonomous complex that acts on its own agenda. In Maria's case, her rejected strategic intelligence had become a paranoid surveillance system. Unable to consciously use her gift for reading people, she was now unconsciously using it to detect threats everywhere. Her capacity for prediction had twisted into prophesying betrayals. Her understanding of behavioral patterns had mutated into conspiracy detection. Every quality she accused others of possessing, manipulation, calculation, strategic withholding, hidden agendas, was actually a description of her own disowned capacities. The dream that broke the case. 6 sessions in, Maria reported a recurring dream that had been haunting her for years. She's in a grand ballroom filled with people in masks. Everyone is dancing, laughing, moving through elaborate social rituals. Maria stands at the edge, unmasked, feeling exposed and vulnerable. In the center of the ballroom, she sees a woman in a black dress and an ornate silver mask. This woman seems to be orchestrating everything, subtly directing conversations, arranging introductions, pulling invisible strings. Everyone does what she wants without realizing they're being directed. Maria is both terrified of and fascinated by this woman. She wants to expose her, to warn everyone that they're being manipulated. But when Maria tries to speak, no sound comes out. The woman in the black dress notices Maria's attempts and walks toward her, gliding through the crowd. When she reaches Maria, she lifts her mask. Underneath is Maria's own face. Maria wakes up gasping. Jung understood immediately that the woman in the black dress was Maria's shadow, the personification of everything she'd rejected about her own intelligence and capability. In Jungian dreamwork, when a shadow figure shares your face, the unconscious is making an announcement. This isn't someone else. This is you. This is the disowned part of yourself that you've been projecting onto the world. Jung asked Maria to enter active imagination with this figure, to consciously dialogue with the woman in the black dress as if she were a real person with her own perspective. The initial sessions were painful. Maria resisted, insisted this was just a dream, tried to intellectualize it away. But Jung persisted, and eventually Maria allowed the shadow to speak. What emerged was extraordinary. The woman in the black dress wasn't evil. She was powerful, competent, strategic. Everything Maria had been taught was unacceptable in a good woman. She understood people deeply. She knew how to navigate social complexity. She could see 6 moves ahead in any interaction, and she was furious at Maria for rejecting her. "You called me manipulative," the shadow spoke through Maria's active imagination. "But I'm the reason you're not constantly exploited. You called me calculating, but I am your intelligence, your wisdom about how humans actually work. You exiled me because you were told that purity means stupidity, that goodness means being blind. And now," the shadow continued, "because you won't consciously own what I know, I operate in the dark. I see betrayal everywhere because you won't let me see accurately. I predict the worst because you won't let me predict at all. You've made me paranoid by refusing to make me conscious." This was the breakthrough moment. Maria began to cry, not tears of sadness, but tears of recognition. She was encountering a part of herself she'd been at war with since childhood, a part that held capabilities she desperately needed, but had labeled as fundamentally wrong. The integration process, Jung's work with Maria over the next 14 months, involved systematic shadow integration, teaching her to consciously reclaim what she'd unconsciously projected. The first stage was acknowledgment. Maria had to own in explicit terms that she was capable of manipulation, calculation, strategy, and social maneuvering, not that she necessarily used these capacities maliciously, but that she possessed them as part of her psychological toolkit. This was agonizing for Maria. Her entire identity had been built on being genuine and pure-hearted. Admitting that she could read people's weaknesses, could strategically withhold information, could influence outcomes through careful social positioning, all of this felt like confessing to being a monster. But Jung reframed it brilliantly. "Maria, a surgeon has the capacity to cut someone open and cause immense harm. Does that make surgery evil, or does it make surgical knowledge powerful, capable of great harm or great healing, depending on consciousness and ethics?" This metaphor cracked something open in Maria's understanding. Her strategic intelligence wasn't inherently bad, it was powerful. And power needs consciousness to be ethical. By making it unconscious, she'd guaranteed it would operate in destructive ways. The second stage was discrimination. Jung taught Maria to differentiate between her projection and actual reality. When she felt someone was manipulating her, she learned to pause and ask, "Am I detecting their manipulation, or am I detecting my own strategic thinking that I've projected onto them?" Initially, Maria couldn't tell the difference. Everything felt like external threat. But gradually, through meticulous tracking and brutal self-honesty, she began to recognize the signature of projection. When the accusation was vague and global, "Everyone is against me," it was projection. When she felt morally superior to the person she was accusing, it was projection. When she couldn't point to specific harmful behaviors but only to a feeling or sense of betrayal, it was projection. Real deception, Maria learned, had different qualities: specific discrepancies, documentable inconsistencies, actual harm caused. And interestingly, as Maria integrated her shadow, she became more capable of detecting genuine deception because she understood it from the inside now, not as a moral failing but as a human capacity. The third stage was embodiment. Jung had Maria practice conscious strategic thinking in low-stakes situations. At the library, she experimented with subtly influencing which books got displayed prominently. In conversation, she practiced reading people's unspoken needs and responding to those rather than just their explicit words. This terrified Maria initially. It felt like becoming the monster. But Jung helped her see that she'd been doing these things unconsciously all along. The only difference now was consciousness, which meant choice and ethics could enter the picture. Maria discovered something profound. Conscious strategy wasn't manipulation. It was intelligence in action. Understanding people deeply wasn't exploitation. It was compassion combined with awareness. The transformation, the shift in Maria's external life was dramatic. Her engagement, which had been on the verge of collapse due to her constant testing and surveillance, stabilized as Maria stopped projecting her inner manipulator onto her fiancé. She realized he wasn't hiding things from her. She'd been hiding her own strategic thinking from herself and seeing it in him. Her relationships with colleagues transformed. Once she stopped accusing them of spreading rumors, she could see they'd actually been trying to help her, concerned about her increasing isolation and paranoia. Even her relationship with her sister healed. Maria had been convinced her sister was manipulating their mother, but in reality, Maria had been engaging in her own complex maneuvering, unconsciously trying to control the family dynamic, while accusing her sister of doing exactly that. The most profound change was internal. Maria described it in her final session with Jung as a kind of coming home to power. She no longer felt perpetually threatened because she'd reclaimed the part of herself that could handle threats. She no longer saw enemies everywhere because she'd integrated the enemy within, the strategic, calculating, powerful shadow self that she'd been taught was unacceptable. And paradoxically, by owning her capacity for manipulation, she became genuinely more trustworthy because now these capacities operated under conscious ethical guidance rather than as autonomous complexes. The final dream. 2 years after completing her work with Jung, Maria sent him a letter describing a dream. She's in the same ballroom, but now she's wearing the black dress and the silver mask. She's dancing with everyone, moving through the crowd with grace and precision. When she removes the mask, she sees her own face, but it's integrated now, whole. She's not ashamed. The other dancers aren't being manipulated. They're being understood, honored in their complexity. She wakes up feeling powerful and, for the first time in her life, at peace with her own intelligence. Jung kept this letter in his files as a perfect illustration of successful shadow integration around trust wounds. Maria hadn't become naively trusting. She'd become maturely discerning. She could identify real deception because she understood the mechanisms from within. She could extend appropriate trust because she trusted herself to handle betrayal if it came. Most importantly, she'd stopped living in a reality where everyone was a potential threat because she'd reclaimed the threatening parts of herself and put them in service of wholeness rather than projection. The lesson for all of us, Maria's case, demonstrates the complete arc of trust wound shadow work: rejection, projection, paranoia, recognition, integration, discernment. Every person you distrust is showing you something about yourself, not because they're safe and you're wrong, but because the intensity of your distrust, especially when it's global and undifferentiated, reveals shadow material you haven't integrated. The manipulator you see everywhere, that's your own intelligence. The betrayer you're constantly defending against, that's your own capacity for necessary boundaries. The liar you detect in every conversation, that's your own strategic thinking. Until you consciously reclaim these capacities, name them, integrate them, and put them under ethical guidance, you'll remain imprisoned in Maria's ballroom, standing at the edge, watching the woman in the black dress orchestrate everything, never realizing she's been you all along. The question Jung would ask you, just as he asked Maria, are you ready to put on the mask and discover your own face underneath? Or will you spend your life accusing everyone else of being the powerful, strategic, complex person you're terrified to admit you are? Jung made his discoveries about trust wound projection in the 1920s, working with dream analysis, active imagination, and clinical observation. He didn't have fMRI machines, He couldn't measure neurotransmitter levels. He had no access to attachment theory research or developmental psychology studies. What he had was profound insight into the human psyche and decades of careful clinical observation. Now, a century later, modern neuroscience has caught up with Jung, and the findings are both validating his core insights and revealing the exact mechanisms by which shadow projection operates in the brain. What Jung intuited, we can now measure. The default mode network. Your projection engine neuroscientists have identified a specific brain network called the default mode network, DMN, a constellation of regions that activate when you're not focused on external tasks, when your mind is wandering, when you're thinking about yourself and others. The DMN includes the medial prefrontal cortex, posterior cingulate cortex, and parts of the temporal and parietal lobes. This network is responsible for what researchers call self-referential processing, the constant narrative your brain generates about who you are, what others think of you, what people's intentions might be. Here's where it gets directly relevant to Trustwound projection. Research from Stanford and Harvard neuroscience labs has shown that individuals with trust issues and attachment wounds demonstrate hyperactive default mode networks. Their brains are constantly generating stories about others' intentions, and crucially, these stories reflect the person's own unconscious content rather than actual external reality. A 2019 study published in Nature Neuroscience used fMRI scanning while participants judged whether others were trustworthy or deceptive. What they found was startling. When people with trust wounds evaluated others, their DMN activation patterns were virtually identical to the patterns when they themselves considered engaging in deceptive behavior. In other words, your brain literally can't tell the difference between thinking about someone else betraying you and thinking about yourself betraying someone else. The same networks light up. The same neural signatures appear. This is the neurological mechanism of projection that Jung identified psychologically. Your hyperactive DMN is constantly scanning for betrayal, but the template it's using is your own unconscious capacity for deception. You're not actually reading the other person. You're reading yourself and mistaking it for external perception. The mentalizing network and mind-reading errors. Related to the DMN is what neuroscientists call the mentalizing network, brain regions involved in inferring others' mental states, beliefs, and intentions. This network includes the temporoparietal junction, superior temporal sulcus, and medial prefrontal cortex. It's what allows you to have a theory of mind, to understand that other people have inner experiences different from your own. In healthy mentalizing, you use contextual cues, behavioral evidence, and explicit communication to make educated guesses about what someone else is thinking or feeling. But research from the University of Colorado and Yale has revealed something Jung would have recognized immediately. People with trust wounds show a specific mentalizing error pattern. They attribute their own rejected traits to others with extraordinarily high confidence, while simultaneously denying those same traits in themselves. The researchers call this projection bias in mentalizing. Jung called it shadow projection. A landmark 2021 study demonstrated this perfectly. Participants completed personality assessments, measuring traits like manipulativeness, dishonesty, and selfishness. Then they were asked to evaluate strangers in videos, rating how manipulative, dishonest, and selfish each stranger appeared. The results were striking. People who scored high on these traits but denied having them, what Jung would call shadow rejection, rated strangers as significantly more manipulative and dishonest than people who consciously acknowledged their own capacity for these behaviors. The conscious owners of complex traits could differentiate between themselves and others. The shadow rejectors couldn't. They saw their rejected traits everywhere. Brain imaging revealed why. When shadow rejectors evaluated others, their medial prefrontal cortex, the region involved in self-representation, showed abnormally high activation. They weren't actually mentalizing about the stranger. They were unconsciously accessing their own rejected self-image and projecting it outward. Attachment neuroscience. The abandoner within the field of attachment neuroscience has provided extraordinary validation for Jung's insight that trust wounds aren't just about being abandoned, they're about unconsciously identifying with the abandoner. Dr. Alan Shore's research on attachment trauma and right brain development reveals a mechanism that Jung intuited but couldn't prove. When a child experiences abandonment or betrayal, the developing brain doesn't just encode "people leave" as a belief. It encodes the entire relational pattern, including both roles, the abandoned and the abandoner. This happens through a process called identificatory internalization. The child's psyche essentially downloads the abandoner's perspective and behavior patterns as part of its own psychological structure. Then, because these patterns are often morally unacceptable to the conscious self, I would never abandon someone, they get relegated to the shadow, where they continue to operate unconsciously. Neuroimaging studies of adults with attachment wounds show something remarkable. When these individuals think about being abandoned, brain regions associated with social pain activate. The dorsal anterior cingulate cortex and anterior insula, the same regions that process physical pain. But when they think about abandoning others, even hypothetically, many of the same pain regions activate, along with regions associated with threat response and defensive deactivation. The interpretation: your brain experiences the thought of abandoning someone else as a threat to your self-concept, triggering the same pain and defense systems as being abandoned yourself. This creates a psychological predicament. You carry the abandoner pattern within you, but experiencing it consciously is so painful and identity-threatening that your psyche projects it outward instead. Everyone else becomes the potential abandoner, so you don't have to feel the unbearable truth that you've already abandoned yourself, and that you're capable of abandoning others. Moral hypocrisy. The Yale studies. Some of the most compelling validation of Jung's shadow projection theory comes from Yale's moral psychology lab, where researchers have been studying what they call moral hypocrisy, the tendency to judge others more harshly for behaviors we ourselves engage in. A series of studies published between 2018 and 2023 use both behavioral experiments and neuroimaging to explore this phenomenon. Participants were given opportunities to lie, cheat, or act selfishly in controlled scenarios. Later, they were asked to judge other people who engaged in identical behaviors. The findings were consistent. People who engaged in the behaviors but felt moral conflict about them, shadow rejection, judged others most harshly. People who engaged in the behaviors and consciously owned them, shadow integration, showed more nuanced judgment. The brain imaging was even more revealing. When judging others for behaviors they themselves had secretly engaged in, participants showed high activation in the anterior cingulate cortex associated with conflict monitoring and reduced activation in regions associated with perspective taking. Their brains were essentially saying, "I see this behavior in this other person. It creates intense internal conflict, and I'm going to reduce that conflict by judging them harshly rather than examining my own behavior." This is the neural signature of projection in real time. The researchers concluded that harsh moral judgment of others functions as a defense mechanism, protecting the judge from uncomfortable self-awareness, exactly what Jung argued a century earlier. Polyvagal theory, the neuroscience of safety and threat. Dr. Stephen Porges' polyvagal theory provides crucial insight into why trust wounds become so entrenched neurologically. The vagus nerve has three primary response patterns: ventral vagal, social engagement. When you feel safe, this system supports connection, communication, and trust. Sympathetic, fight or flight. When you perceive threat, this system activates defense and hypervigilance. Dorsal vagal, shutdown. When threat feels overwhelming, this system triggers collapse and withdrawal. Here's what polyvagal research reveals about trust wound projection. People with chronic trust issues exist in a state called autonomic inflexibility. Their nervous systems are stuck in threat detection mode, sympathetic, or shutdown mode, dorsal vagal, unable to access the social engagement system, ventral vagal. But here's the projection component that Jung would recognize. When your nervous system is locked in defensive states, it begins to interpret neutral or even positive social cues as threatening. Your partner's gentle touch gets read as violation. A friend's question feels like interrogation. Kindness appears manipulative. This isn't because these people are actually threatening. It's because your autonomic nervous system has decided that connection itself is dangerous, and it's scanning constantly for evidence to confirm this. The neuroception system, your body's unconscious threat detection, becomes hyperactive and indiscriminate. Everything registers as potential danger because the threat you're really trying to avoid is internal. The vulnerability required for genuine connection. Research shows that as people integrate their shadows and develop secure attachment, their nervous systems regain flexibility. They can move fluidly between states. They can access social engagement without the constant undercurrent of threat. This physiological shift validates Jung's psychological model. Shadow integration doesn't just change your thoughts, it changes your body's fundamental relationship to safety and connection. The insula and interoceptive awareness. The insula is a brain region involved in interoceptive awareness, your ability to sense and interpret signals from your body, including emotional states. Recent research from the University of California has shown that people with trust wounds often have both hyperactive insulae, over-reading threat signals, and poor interoceptive differentiation, unable to distinguish between different types of emotional arousal. What this means practically, your body might be sending signals of excitement, attraction, or curiosity, but because your insula is hyperactive and poorly differentiated, you interpret these signals as anxiety or threat. You meet someone, wonderful. Your body responds with arousal and interest, but your brain misreads this as danger, triggering all your trust wound defenses. This is a physiological mechanism that maintains projection. Your body's genuine positive responses to connection get misinterpreted as warnings, confirming your belief that intimacy is threatening. Mirror neurons and empathic projection. The discovery of mirror neurons has provided insight into how projection operates at the most fundamental level of social cognition. Mirror neurons fire both when you perform an action and when you observe someone else performing the same action. They're the basis of empathy, imitation, and social learning. But research from UCLA's Social Cognitive Neuroscience Lab has revealed a critical finding. In people with trust wounds, mirror neuron systems show two problematic patterns: hyperactivation. Their mirror systems respond more intensely to perceived deception or betrayal than to neutral or positive social behaviors. Reversed mirroring. When they observe someone else's behavior, their mirror systems activate as if they themselves were performing the behavior. But when they perform potentially deceptive behaviors themselves, the mirror systems don't activate properly. This creates a neurological double standard. You experience others' actions as if you're doing them, which is normal mirroring. but you don't experience your own actions with the same empathic awareness. Result: you feel others' potential betrayal intensely because you're mirroring it as if you're doing it, while remaining unconscious of your own parallel behaviors. This is the neural mechanism of, I can see clearly what they're doing wrong, but I'm completely blind to my own patterns. The hallmark of shadow projection. Prefrontal cortex inhibition and shadow suppression. The prefrontal cortex is involved in executive function, including the suppression of unwanted thoughts and impulses. Neuroimaging studies have shown that active shadow suppression, trying not to think about your own capacity for deception, betrayal, or manipulation, requires constant prefrontal cortex activation. This is metabolically expensive. Your brain is burning energy all day to keep shadow material out of consciousness. But here's the paradox that neuroscience confirms. The more energy you spend suppressing shadow content, the more likely it is to leak out through projection. The prefrontal cortex can't maintain complete suppression indefinitely, and when it fatigues, the suppressed content erupts into consciousness disguised as perception of external threats. This is why Trustwound hypervigilance often intensifies when you're stressed, tired, or emotionally depleted. Your prefrontal suppression weakens, shadow material surges, and you suddenly see betrayal everywhere. You're not becoming more perceptive. You're becoming less able to maintain the firewall between your shadow and your conscious awareness. The integration, insight. All of this modern neuroscience points to a single conclusion that validates Jung's core insight. Your brain literally cannot distinguish between perceiving deception in others and imagining yourself engaging in deception, especially when you've rejected those capacities as fundamentally unacceptable. The neural networks involved are the same. The activation patterns are identical. The only difference is the story your conscious mind tells about whose deception you're detecting. The pathway to healing isn't learning to trust others more blindly. It's integrating shadow material so thoroughly that your brain no longer needs to project it outward to maintain psychological coherence. When you consciously own your capacity for manipulation, betrayal, and strategic deception, when you acknowledge these as human capabilities you possess and can choose to use ethically, the hyperactivation diminishes. Your default mode network calms. Your mentalizing becomes more accurate. Your nervous system regains flexibility. Your mirror neurons function normally. You don't become naive. You become discerning. You don't lose the ability to detect threats. You gain the ability to distinguish between real threats and projected shadows. And you finally escape the neurological prison of seeing enemies everywhere, because you've reclaimed the enemy within and transformed it into wisdom. Jung discovered that trust-wound projection doesn't manifest identically in everyone. While the core mechanism is the same, rejected shadow material projected onto others, the specific form it takes depends on which archetypal pattern organizes the personality around the wound. Through decades of clinical work, Jung identified 5 distinct trust wound archetypes. Each represents a specific way of rejecting shadow material and the corresponding projection pattern that emerges. Understanding which pattern you carry isn't just intellectual curiosity, it's the first step in shadow integration. You can't reclaim what you can't name. Let's map all 5 patterns with precision so you can locate yourself in this typology. Type 1, the wounded sage. The wounded sage has intellectualized their trust wound, transforming suspicion into a philosophical stance about human nature. These are the people who will tell you, with great sophistication, that trust is naive, that humans are fundamentally self-interested, that expecting loyalty is a sign of immaturity. They've read their Machiavelli, their Hobbes, their evolutionary psychology about selfish genes. They present their distrust as wisdom, as having learned the way things really are. But Jung saw through this immediately. The wounded sage hasn't become wise. They've become identified with the wise old man archetype as a defense against vulnerability. The shadow they've rejected, the naive fool. What the wounded sage absolutely cannot tolerate in themselves is innocence. They despise naivety, not just in others, but in the parts of themselves that still want to believe in genuine goodness, in loyalty that isn't transaction-based, in love that doesn't have hidden terms. The naive fool is their disowned inner child, the part that once trusted completely and got hurt. Rather than integrate that wound, they've expelled the entire capacity for innocent faith. The projection pattern wounded sages see naive fools everywhere. They're constantly pointing out how others are setting themselves up to get hurt by trusting too easily. They feel superior to people in healthy relationships, certain that these naive souls just haven't been tested yet. What they don't see, their cynical worldview is just as naive as the blind trust they criticize. They've simply inverted the naivety. Instead of believing everyone is good, they believe everyone is bad. Both positions lack discernment. Dream symbols. In dreams, wounded sages often encounter child figures they must protect from danger, but they protect through isolation rather than empowerment. Or they dream of teachers and wise figures who are revealed to be charlatans. These dreams are the psyche's attempt to show them that their wisdom is actually a defense, and that real wisdom includes the capacity for appropriate trust. The integration path. The wounded sage must consciously embody the naive fool, not to become naive, but to reclaim innocence as a capacity. This means admitting, I am capable of blind trust. I am capable of hope without evidence. I am capable of believing in goodness. Once they own this shadow, they can develop genuine wisdom that includes both discernment and faith, rather than cynicism masquerading as intelligence. Type 2, the hypervigilant protector. The hypervigilant protector is constantly scanning for danger. Their nervous system never rests. Every conversation is analyzed for hidden meanings. Every relationship is monitored for signs of impending betrayal. They pride themselves on being realistic and prepared. They'll never be blindsided again because they're always on guard. Jung recognized this pattern as identification with the guardian archetype, the defender who stands at the gate, allowing no threats to enter. But the guardian has become tyrannical, seeing threats where none exist. The shadow they've rejected. The predator. The hypervigilant protector's rejected shadow is their own predatory capacity, their ability to harm, exploit, manipulate, or dominate others. Often, these individuals were victimized by a predator, abusive parent, manipulative partner, traumatic betrayal. Instead of integrating both victim and predator within themselves, they've identified completely with the victim and projected all predatory qualities outward. This creates a terrible bind. They see predators everywhere because they can't consciously acknowledge that they too have predatory instincts, the capacity to hurt someone who hurts them, the urge to dominate rather than be dominated, the strategic intelligence that could be used for exploitation. The projection pattern. Hypervigilant protectors see hidden predators in everyone. A partner comes home late, and the immediate fear is infidelity. A friend asks a question, and it feels like an interrogation. A colleague's success triggers paranoia about sabotage. They're not crazy. They're often correct that people have mixed motives, that humans are complex, that situations contain multiple layers. But they can't differentiate between normal human complexity and actual predatory intent, because they've rejected their own predatory shadow entirely. Dream symbols. Common dream themes include being chased, attacked from behind, betrayed by trusted allies who reveal themselves as enemies. There are also dreams where they themselves become the attacker, which typically wake them in distress and get immediately suppressed. The psyche is trying to show them, you are both hunted and hunter. Until you integrate both, you'll live in perpetual fear. The integration path. The hypervigilant protector must do the terrifying work of embodying their inner predator in safe, conscious ways. This means admitting, I am capable of hurting people. I have predatory instincts. I could exploit if I chose to. Jung would have them dialogue with their inner predator, learning its language, understanding its gifts, including boundary setting and self-protection, and bringing it under conscious ethical guidance rather than letting it operate as an unconscious paranoid projection. Type 3. The test master. The test master creates elaborate systems for evaluating others' trustworthiness. They don't necessarily seem paranoid. In fact, they often appear quite social and engaged. But underneath the surface, every interaction is a test. If they really cared, they would, let's see if they show up when I actually need them. I'll tell them something personal and see if they use it against me. Jung saw this pattern as identification with the judge archetype, but a judge who operates in secret, gathering evidence without the accused, even knowing they're on trial. The shadow they've rejected. The judge and executioner test masters have rejected their own capacity for harsh judgment and condemnation. Often they grew up in environments where they were constantly judged, evaluated, found wanting. They internalized the judge, but couldn't consciously accept being that judgmental themselves. So the judge went into the shadow where it became even harsher, creating impossible standards that no one can meet. The shadow also contains the executioner, the part that delivers final verdicts, cuts people off, withdraws love as punishment. Test masters often feel guilty about these impulses, so they create objective tests that allow the executioner to operate while maintaining the conscious self-image of being fair and giving people chances. The projection pattern. Test masters project judgment everywhere. They feel constantly evaluated by others, criticized, scrutinized, found insufficient. They're hypersensitive to perceived judgment because they're unconsciously judging everyone else constantly. They create relationships where no one can ever fully pass the test because the test itself is designed by their shadow judge, whose standards are deliberately impossible as punishment for their own internalized sense of inadequacy. Dream symbols. Dreams often feature courtrooms, exams they're unprepared for, situations where they're being evaluated or tested. Sometimes they dream of being the judge or executioner, but these dreams are quickly forgotten or dismissed as just weird. The psyche is revealing. You are both the judged and the judge. The test you're giving others is the test you're giving yourself. The integration path. Test masters must consciously own their judge and executioner shadows. This means admitting, I am judgmental, I am harsh, I have impossible standards, I am capable of withdrawing love as punishment. Once owned, these qualities can be transformed. Judgment becomes discernment. Harsh standards become high integrity. The executioner becomes the capacity for necessary endings rather than passive-aggressive testing. Type 4, the emotional fortress. The emotional fortress has built impenetrable walls and called it strength. They pride themselves on not needing anyone, on being completely self-sufficient, on having transcended the weakness of emotional dependency. They often use spiritual or psychological language. I'm an independent person. I don't need validation from others. I've learned to complete myself. But Jung recognized this as identification with the hermit or fortress archetype, the isolated figure who has withdrawn from the battlefield of relationship rather than learning to engage skillfully. The shadow they've rejected. The vulnerable child. What the emotional fortress cannot tolerate is their own neediness. They've rejected the vulnerable child archetype, the part that wants to be held, seen, protected, loved. They experienced these needs as dangerous, often because they were exploited or shamed in early life. So they expelled them entirely. The shadow contains all their longing for connection, all their desire to be cared for, all their wish to lower their guard and simply rest in someone else's strength for a moment. The projection pattern. Emotional fortresses project neediness and weakness onto everyone else. They're contemptuous of people who openly express emotional needs, who depend on their partners, who admit to wanting connection. They're so needy. They can't be alone with themselves. They're too dependent on external validation. Every accusation is a description of their disowned, vulnerable child who cries behind the fortress walls where no one, including themselves, can hear. Dream symbols. Dreams often feature locked doors, insurmountable walls, castles, or fortresses under siege. Sometimes there's a child trapped in a tower or basement, the literal symbolism of the imprisoned, vulnerable child. Other dreams show the fortress crumbling or being breached, which the dreamer experiences as nightmare rather than liberation, because they've identified so completely with the defensive structure. The integration path. The emotional fortress must do the terrifying work of allowing their walls to come down, not through forced vulnerability, but through conscious acknowledgement of their needs. This means admitting, I am needy, I want to be loved, I need connection, I am not self-sufficient, I'm just defended. Jung would have them dialogue with the trapped child within, learning what they truly need, and gradually allowing those needs into consciousness and appropriate expression. Type 5. The betrayal prophet. The betrayal prophet lives in constant expectation of abandonment. It's not a question of if people will leave, it's just a matter of when. They often describe having a sixth sense about betrayal. They can just feel when someone is about to leave, when loyalty is wavering, when the end is near, and they're often right, but not because they're psychic, because they're orchestrating the very abandonment they predict. Jung saw this pattern as identification with the Cassandra archetype, the prophet whose predictions are always true but never believed. But the prophecy is self-fulfilling. The shadow they've rejected, the abandoner. The betrayal prophet has rejected their own capacity for abandonment. Often they were abandoned early in life. Parent left, caregiver was unreliable, attachment figure was inconsistent. And they identified so completely with being the abandoned one that they can't see how they've internalized the abandoner. The shadow contains their own wish to leave first, their desire to preemptively reject others before being rejected, their capacity to emotionally withdraw or physically exit relationships. Most painfully, the shadow contains the moment when they abandoned themselves, when they decided their needs were too much. Their love was too intense, their presence was the problem. They became their own abandoner, but this is too painful to acknowledge. The projection pattern betrayal prophets see abandonment coming constantly. A partner gets busy at work and they immediately feel it. They're pulling away. A friend cancels plans and the interpretation is, they're done with me. They're not reading the other person. They're reading their own shadow abandoner, who is always one step away from leaving. The prophecy becomes a self-fulfilling spiral. They become so convinced abandonment is coming that they either preemptively withdraw, abandoning first, or become so clingy and testing that they push the person away, creating the abandonment they feared. Dream symbols. Common dreams include being left behind, trains or planes leaving without them, lovers walking away, standing alone in empty houses, or deserted landscapes. There are also dreams where they themselves are the one leaving, but they wake before facing the implications. The psyche is revealing. You are both the abandoned and the abandoner. The leaving you fear is the leaving you're already doing. The integration path. Betrayal prophets must consciously own their inner abandoner. This means admitting the hardest truth. I am capable of leaving. I have abandoned myself. I could abandon others. I want to leave before being left. This isn't about acting on these impulses. It's about bringing them into consciousness where they can be understood, integrated, and transformed into the mature capacity to leave situations that are genuinely harmful rather than perpetually fearing abandonment in healthy connections. Cross-pattern integration. Many people don't fit cleanly into one type. They might be a combination of wounded sage and emotional fortress, or hypervigilant protector and test master. What matters isn't perfect categorization. What matters is recognition. As you read these 5 patterns, something probably stirred: recognition, resistance, discomfort. That's your shadow signaling. This is me. This is what I've been avoiding seeing. Jung's question for you is simple. Which rejected archetype have you been projecting onto everyone around you? And are you finally ready to turn around and face the mirror? Jung didn't mince words about the consequences of unintegrated shadow material. He watched patients spend entire lifetimes trapped in projection cycles, destroying every relationship, sabotaging every connection, living in what he called self-created hells, while blaming everyone else for their isolation. The dangers of Trustwound projection aren't merely uncomfortable. They're catastrophic, not in dramatic explosions, but in slow, grinding destruction of everything that makes human life meaningful. Let's examine the 5 escalating dangers with brutal honesty, because understanding the stakes is what creates the urgency for transformation. Danger 1. Relationship annihilation, the emotional desert. The first and most immediate consequence of unintegrated trust wound shadows is the systematic destruction of intimate relationships. This doesn't happen dramatically. It happens gradually, through 1,000 small acts of suspicion, testing, and withdrawal. You meet someone wonderful. The connection feels real, but your shadow immediately begins its work. Is this real, or are they just charming me? What do they really want? What are they hiding? How long until they reveal their true nature? The questions are relentless. The tests begin. The surveillance starts. Your partner feels it. They don't understand it yet, but they feel the constant undercurrent of distrust. They feel evaluated rather than enjoyed. They sense they're perpetually on trial for crimes they haven't committed. At first, they try harder. They give reassurance. They prove their loyalty through actions. But it's never enough, because the distrust isn't about them. It's about your shadow. Eventually, one of 3 things happens. They leave, exhausted by the constant testing and unable to endure being suspected of betrayals they never contemplated. You interpret this as proof you were right all along. They weren't trustworthy. You miss entirely that your projection created the abandonment you feared. They become inauthentic, learning that honesty gets scrutinized and questioned, so they start hiding benign things just to avoid interrogation. This actually creates the dishonesty you suspected, confirming your projection while obscuring your role in creating it. They become as defended as you are, building their own walls, shutting down emotionally, until you're 2 fortresses coexisting but never connecting. You interpret their withdrawal as proof they don't care, while they're actually protecting themselves from constant suspicion. Jung observed this pattern repeatedly. Trust wound projection doesn't just damage one relationship, it creates a template that replicates across every intimate connection. You don't learn from the pattern because you're convinced the problem is external. I just keep picking the wrong people. I just keep getting unlucky. Why do I keep attracting liars and betrayers? The question you never ask is the one that could save you. What am I projecting that creates this exact dynamic every single time? After enough relationship failures, something tragic happens. You stop trying. You decide that relationships aren't for you, that you're better off alone, that you're too damaged or others are too unreliable. You create what Jung called an emotional desert, a life structure where deep connection becomes impossible. You tell yourself you've transcended the need for intimacy. You pride yourself on your independence. But Jung would see through this immediately. You haven't transcended the need for connection. You've abandoned the part of yourself that still longs for it, and now you're living in the projection of that abandonment, where everyone else appears to be either threatening or insufficient. The desert expands. Years pass. The isolation becomes normalized. You forget what genuine intimacy even feels like. Danger, 2. Professional sabotage. The collaboration ceiling. Trust wound projection doesn't only destroy romantic relationships, it systematically undermines professional success. Modern work requires collaboration. Leadership requires delegation. Growth requires partnership. But trust wound projection makes all of these impossible. You can't delegate because you don't trust anyone to do it right. You become the micromanager who creates resentment and inefficiency while telling yourself you're just maintaining standards. You can't build strategic partnerships because you're convinced everyone has hidden agendas. You sabotage opportunities by over-negotiating, demanding impossible proof of good faith, or withdrawing at the moment when trust becomes necessary. You can't accept mentorship because you're suspicious of anyone who offers to help without obvious benefit. You reject guidance from those who could accelerate your growth, certain they must have ulterior motives. Jung identified a specific pattern he called the collaboration ceiling, the point at which professional advancement requires trust that the shadow-wounded individual simply cannot extend. You might be brilliant individually. You might excel at tasks within your direct control, but the moment success requires genuine collaboration, trusting colleagues with important responsibilities, accepting vulnerability within a team, building relationships based on mutual benefit rather than surveillance. You hit a ceiling, and you hit it repeatedly across different jobs and industries, while blaming external factors. They weren't competent. The culture was political. Management was corrupt. The question you never consider: am I creating the same dynamic at every organization because I'm bringing the same projection? The financial consequences are measurable. Studies Jung would have loved show that inability to trust appropriate collaborators can reduce lifetime earning potential by millions of dollars. The opportunities you reject, the partnerships you sabotage, the leadership positions you can't accept because they require trusting a team. All of this adds up to a massive opportunity cost. But the deeper cost is the loss of meaningful work. Humans are tribal creatures. We're designed to accomplish great things collaboratively. When trust-wound projection isolates you professionally, you're not just losing income, you're losing the satisfaction of co-creation, the joy of shared achievement, the meaning that comes from building something larger than yourself. You end up working alone, telling yourself it's preferable, while your shadow, the part that longs for collaborative triumph, remains rejected and projected onto the untrustworthy colleagues you've convinced yourself you're better off without. Danger 3. Psychological fragmentation, the cost of constant projection. Jung understood that shadow projection isn't psychologically free. It requires enormous psychic energy to maintain. Every time you project, your psyche has to do several things simultaneously. Suppress the shadow material in yourself, project it onto someone else, generate a narrative explaining why you're seeing it out there rather than in here. defend against any evidence that contradicts the projection, create behaviors that confirm the projection, testing, surveillance, interpretation of ambiguous data as threatening. This is exhausting. Patients with chronic trust wound projection consistently report chronic fatigue, inability to relax even in safe situations, difficulty concentrating, constant rumination about others' intentions, and a pervasive sense that life requires exhausting vigilance. Jung recognized these symptoms as the cost of maintaining the split between conscious and shadow selves. The more energy you spend on projection, the less energy you have for actual living. Your psyche becomes increasingly rigid, increasingly defensive, increasingly fragmented. You develop what Jung called autonomous complexes, aspects of personality that split off and operate semi-independently, pursuing their own agendas while your conscious self struggles to maintain coherence. The trust wound complex becomes like a separate personality operating within you. It scans for threat, interprets ambiguous situations as dangerous, generates anxiety and suspicion, and undermines your conscious intentions to connect. You might consciously want intimacy, but the complex sabotages it. You might consciously desire partnership, but the complex creates distance. And because the complex is operating autonomously, fed by shadow projection, your conscious efforts to change your patterns fail repeatedly. This leads to a terrifying experience Jung documented extensively, the sense of being possessed by something you can't control. I don't want to be suspicious, but I can't help it. I tell myself I trust them, but my body reacts with anxiety. I know I'm being unreasonable, but I can't stop testing them. This isn't willpower failure. This is autonomous complex activity, the shadow operating independently because you won't integrate it consciously. The psychological fragmentation escalates over time. You develop separate selves, the self that wants connection, the self that sabotages it, the self that observes the sabotage with confusion and shame. The internal civil war becomes the defining feature of your inner life. Depression and anxiety disorders frequently emerge as secondary consequences. The depression comes from the isolation and meaninglessness of a defended life. The anxiety comes from the constant hypervigilance required to maintain projection. And here's the tragic irony. The psychiatric treatment focuses on managing symptoms, antidepressants for the depression, anxiolytics for the anxiety, while the core issue, the unintegrated shadow driving the trust wound projection, remains completely unaddressed. You might feel slightly better pharmacologically, but the projection continues, the fragmentation deepens, and the authentic self, the whole self that Jung believed was your birthright, remains inaccessible. Danger. 4. Generational transmission. The inheritance of Shadow 1 of Jung's most somber observations was that shadow material doesn't die with the individual who rejects it. It gets transmitted to the next generation. Children of trust-wounded parents inherit the projection pattern not through genetics, but through relational modeling. They learn from the earliest age that the world is fundamentally untrustworthy. The mechanism is straightforward. A trust-wounded parent treats their child with the same suspicion they treat everyone else. The child senses constant evaluation, testing, conditional love based on proving trustworthiness, or the parent, aware that they're suspicious of others, tries to protect their child by teaching them to be equally vigilant. Don't trust anyone. People will hurt you if you let them. Always watch your back. Or the parent simply models the pattern through their own relationships. The child watches mom or dad destroy connection after connection through projection and learns. This is what relationships are: constant surveillance, inevitable betrayal, necessary isolation. Jung documented cases where trust wound patterns had been transmitted through 3 or 4 generations. each new person inheriting the shadow and then projecting it onto their own relationships and children. The tragedy multiplies exponentially. It's not just your life being consumed by projection, it's the lives of everyone who comes after you. I've worked with clients whose grandparents' trust wounds, never integrated, always projected, shaped their parents' relationship patterns, which shaped their own capacity for intimacy. 3 generations of isolation, all stemming from one person's refusal to face their shadow. And the children growing up in trust-wounded households don't just inherit the projection pattern, they inherit the justification for it. My parent was right to be suspicious. They were protecting themselves. They were being realistic. I should be the same. The shadow becomes family legacy, passed down like genetic inheritance, but far more insidious because it poses as wisdom and protection. Breaking this pattern requires someone in the lineage to do what Jung insisted was each person's responsibility. Face your shadow, integrate your projections, refuse to pass the burden to the next generation. But most people don't. They project onto their children. Their children project onto their children, and the original wound metastasizes across generations until entire family systems are organized around distrust, surveillance, and the impossibility of genuine connection. Danger, R5, existential imprisonment, the loss of soul. The ultimate danger Jung identified wasn't psychological in the clinical sense, it was existential, a loss so profound that it constituted spiritual death while the body still lived. He called it living in the shadow's prison, a state where the projected shadow material has so thoroughly consumed your reality that you lose access to everything that makes human life meaningful. Let's be specific about what gets lost. Spontaneity dies because every interaction must be calculated for threat. You can't be present to the moment because you're constantly analyzing for hidden dangers. Joy becomes impossible because you can't relax into pleasure without immediately suspecting it will be taken away or was manipulative to begin with. Love is inaccessible, not because people don't love you, but because you literally cannot receive love through the fortress of projection you've built. Even when someone loves you genuinely, your shadow interprets it as strategy or delusion. Meaning collapses because meaning emerges through authentic encounter with others, and projection makes authentic encounter structurally impossible. You can only meet your own shadow reflected back, never the actual human before you. Awe and wonder disappear because these experiences require vulnerability to something larger than yourself, and your trust wound has made all vulnerability feel like existential threat. Jung observed patients in this state and described them as technically alive but spiritually dead. They went through the motions of living, working, maintaining routines, existing, but the animating force of life, what Jung called the self, had been locked away behind walls of projection. This is hell, not fire and brimstone, but the cold isolation of a reality where everything potentially beautiful has been preemptively defended against. And the most terrifying aspect, you might not even realize what you've lost because the loss has been so complete. You've normalized the desert you've called the prison wisdom. You've reframed existential death as realistic living. Jung's warning was clear. This is how lives end, not with dramatic destruction, but with quiet suffocation, where the projection becomes so complete that you forget you're imprisoned at all. You die having never truly lived, having never truly connected, having spent your entire existence defending against shadows you mistook for external threats. The tragedy isn't what happens to you externally. The tragedy is what doesn't happen internally. The integration that would have set you free, the wholeness that was your birthright, the authentic existence that projection made impossible. This is the highest stake. not just comfort or happiness, but soul itself. And the countdown has already begun. Every day you delay shadow integration is a day spent in this prison, a day your life force diminishes, a day you move closer to death, having never truly lived. Jung's question echoes across time. How much longer will you let your rejected shadow consume the only life you have? Jung didn't just identify the problem of trust wound projection, he mapped the complete solution. His therapeutic approach, refined over 40 years of clinical practice, provides a systematic pathway from shadow rejection to integration, from projection to discernment, from isolation to authentic connection. This isn't quick, this isn't easy, but it works. Let's walk through Jung's shadow integration blueprint step by step so you have the exact methodology that transformed his most wounded patients from paranoid isolation to mature trust. Stage 1. Recognition through mirror analysis. Jung's first principle: you cannot integrate what you haven't recognized. Shadow work begins with the systematic documentation of your projections, turning the unconscious pattern into conscious material you can examine. The method is straightforward but requires brutal honesty. For 2 weeks, keep a detailed projection journal. Every time you feel distrust, suspicion, or the urge to test someone's loyalty, document it immediately with these specific details. Who triggered the distrust? Specific person. What exactly did they do or say that felt untrustworthy? Specific behavior. What quality or motivation did you attribute to them? Manipulative, dishonest, selfish, calculating, etc. What physical sensations accompanied the distrust? Chest tightness, stomach clenching, etc. What thoughts immediately followed? What stories did your mind generate about their intentions? After 2 weeks, you'll have dozens of entries. Now comes the recognition work. Look for patterns, not in the people you distrusted, in the qualities you attributed to them. Do you consistently see manipulation? That's likely your rejected strategic intelligence. Do you consistently see selfishness? That's likely your rejected capacity for appropriate self-interest. Do you consistently see dishonesty? That's likely your rejected capacity for necessary boundaries and selective disclosure. Jung had patients physically write out the statement, "Every person I accused of quality was showing me my own rejected capacity for quality." This is the mirror analysis, seeing your own face in everyone you've been suspecting. The resistance to this recognition is enormous. Your ego will fight it with everything it has. No, they really were manipulative. I'm not making this up. There's real evidence. This is different. I'm actually seeing their flaws, not projecting mine. Jung's response was always the same. Perhaps you're right. Perhaps they really are dishonest. But why does their dishonesty trigger such intense reaction in you? Why this person and not others? What in you is being activated? The key insight: even when you're correctly identifying problematic behavior in someone else, your emotional intensity about it reveals something about your shadow. Integrated people can observe others' flaws with relative neutrality. The intense charge indicates projection. Stage 2. Active imagination with the betrayer. Once you've recognized the pattern, Jung's next stage involves direct confrontation with the shadow through active imagination, a process he considered one of his most important therapeutic innovations. Here's how it works. Find a quiet space where you won't be interrupted for 30 to 45 minutes. This work is best done in early morning or late evening, when the unconscious is closer to the surface. Close your eyes and visualize the quality you've been projecting: betrayal, manipulation, dishonesty, as a personified figure. Don't force a specific image. Let it emerge from the unconscious. For many people with trust wounds, this figure appears as a shadowy version of themselves. someone who hurt them in the past, an archetypal figure, the trickster, the deceiver, the manipulator. An abstract presence they can sense but not fully see. Once the figure appears, Jung's instruction is simple but profound. Have a conversation with it, not in your head as random thoughts, but out loud or in writing, giving the shadow figure full permission to speak its perspective. Start with, "Who are you? What do you want me to understand?" Then listen. Let responses emerge without censoring them. What typically happens is extraordinary. The shadow figure doesn't present as evil. It presents as rejected power, wisdom, capability. A composite example from Jung's case files. Patient: "Who are you?" Shadow: "I'm the part of you that knows how people really work. I see through social facades. I understand power dynamics and hidden agendas." Patient: "But you're manipulative. You're what I hate about people." Shadow: "No, I'm strategic intelligence. You called me manipulative because you were taught that seeing clearly is sinful, that understanding how to influence outcomes is evil. So you buried me. And now I operate in darkness, suspicious of everyone because you won't let me operate in light." Patient: "What do you want?" Shadow: "I want integration. I want you to consciously own that you're capable of strategy, of necessary deception, of protecting yourself through wisdom rather than paranoia. Stop projecting me onto everyone else. Let me serve you consciously." Jung guided patients through multiple active imagination sessions, gradually building a relationship with their shadow rather than remaining in opposition to it. The transformation happens when you can finally say to the shadow figure, "You're not my enemy. You're my rejected power. I'm ready to bring you back." Stage 3. Dream work as shadow integration. Jung believed dreams were the psyche's natural integration mechanism, the nightly attempt to show consciousness what it's been missing. For Trustwound healing, specific dream analysis practices accelerate integration. Dream incubation: before sleep, consciously request dreams that reveal your trust wound shadow. The exact phrasing matters. Jung recommended, "Show me the parts of myself I've been projecting onto others. Reveal my rejected capacities." Recording: keep a dream journal immediately by your bed. The shadow appears most clearly in dreams, but the conscious mind quickly suppresses these images upon waking. Character analysis. In your recorded dreams, identify any figures who appear threatening, untrustworthy, or manipulative. Jung's key question: what if this figure represents a rejected part of me rather than an external threat? A classic dream pattern Jung documented. You're being chased by a threatening figure. You run, hide, feel terrified. The figure is relentless. Finally cornered, you turn to face them and see your own face. This is the psyche's most direct communication. Stop running from yourself. The threat is your rejected shadow. Turn and integrate. Another common pattern: you discover someone you trusted has betrayed you in the dream. You feel devastated, but upon waking analysis, you realize the betrayal was actually them telling you an uncomfortable truth about yourself that you didn't want to hear. The dream was showing you that what you call betrayal is often just someone reflecting back the shadow material you've been projecting. Stage 4. Shadow integration rituals. Jung developed specific practices for consciously embodying shadow qualities in controlled, ethical ways, proving to yourself that you can possess these capacities without becoming monstrous. Ritual 1. The strategic day. Choose one day where you consciously practice strategic thinking in all interactions. Before meetings, consider how you'll present information for maximum impact. In conversations, notice what you're revealing versus concealing and make those choices deliberately rather than unconsciously. The point isn't to manipulate or harm. It's to consciously own that you're always making these choices anyway. Bringing strategy into consciousness transforms it from shadow projection into integrated skill. Ritual 2. The confession practice. Jung had patients write out explicit confessions of their shadow capacities. I am capable of manipulation when I choose to be. I have lied to protect myself and will likely do so again. I am capable of emotional withdrawal as punishment. I could betray someone if the circumstances were right. These statements are spoken aloud, ideally to a therapist or trusted person who won't recoil in judgment. The act of confession, without shame, just acknowledgement, begins the integration. Ritual 3. The opposite day. For one day, deliberately act opposite to your Trustwound pattern. If you're a fortress guardian, ask for help 3 times. If you're a test master, accept someone's word at face value without verification. If you're hypervigilant, practice conscious relaxation of scanning. The goal isn't to stay in this opposite position forever. It's to prove to yourself that you can survive without your defenses, that the catastrophe you fear won't actually occur. Ritual 4. The shadow letter. Write a letter from your shadow self to your conscious self, explaining everything it wants you to understand. Let it speak without censorship. Dear your name, I am the part of you that you've been calling untrustworthy in everyone else. Here's what I need you to know. Then write a response from your conscious self, negotiating integration rather than continued rejection. Stage 5. Moral inventory without judgment. Jung insisted that integration requires complete honesty about your actual behavior, not just your self-concept. Create a detailed moral inventory documenting times when you've been dishonest, even in small ways, manipulated situations to your advantage, withheld information strategically, withdrawn emotionally as punishment, tested others without telling them, used vulnerability as a strategy to control, abandoned someone, including yourself. This isn't for shame or self-flagellation. It's for accuracy. You cannot integrate what you believe you don't possess. Jung's approach was revolutionary. He reframed these behaviors not as evidence of being a bad person, but as evidence of being a complete person. You possess all human capacities. The question isn't whether you're capable of betrayal. You are. Everyone is. The question is, are these capacities operating consciously under ethical guidance or unconsciously through projection? Stage 6. Differentiation practice. The most sophisticated stage of Jung's integration process is learning to distinguish between projection and genuine perception. This is crucial because shadow integration doesn't mean becoming naive. It means developing mature discernment that can identify real threats, precisely because it understands the mechanisms from within. Jung taught patients a differentiation protocol. When you feel distrust, pause and ask these specific questions. Is there specific behavioral evidence of untrustworthiness? Or am I responding to a feeling, suspicion? Projection tends to be feeling-based. Genuine detection is evidence-based. Have I felt this same quality in multiple people in similar situations? If yes, likely projection creating a repeating pattern. Am I morally certain the other person is bad wrong while I am good damn right? Moral superiority is a hallmark of projection. What quality am I attributing to them? Do I possess this quality myself? If you possess it but reject it, you're likely projecting. Would an outside observer see the same threat I'm seeing? Projection is often invisible to others because it's internal. Jung was clear. Sometimes people are genuinely untrustworthy. Integration doesn't mean trusting everyone indiscriminately. It means you can now distinguish between real threat, specific patterns of behavior that demonstrate untrustworthiness, assessed without intense emotional charge, visible to multiple observers. Projected threat, vague feelings of danger, intense emotional reactions. patterns you see repeatedly in everyone, qualities you possess but reject in yourself. Over time, patients developed what Jung called integrated discernment, the capacity to trust appropriately because they'd reclaimed their own complexity. They could spot real manipulation because they understood manipulation from within, not because they suspected it everywhere. Stage 7. Relational repatterning. The final stage involves actually changing relationship patterns through integrated shadow work. Jung had patients identify one close relationship where they'd been chronically projecting, then acknowledge the projection directly. I realize I've been suspecting you of quality that I haven't wanted to admit exists in myself. Apologize for the projection's impact. I understand this created distance and probably made you feel constantly evaluated. Demonstrate the integrated quality. I'm working to consciously own my capacity for quality so I stop seeing it as threatening in others. Request patience during integration. I might still project sometimes, but I'm committed to catching it faster and taking responsibility. This level of vulnerability terrifies trust-wounded people because it requires admitting you were wrong, exposing your shadow work, and trusting that the other person won't weaponize your confession. But Jung found that this very act of vulnerable honesty was often the breakthrough that healed the relationship, because it demonstrated genuine change rather than just professed change. The integration timeline. Jung was honest about the timeline. Shadow integration for deep trust wounds typically takes 12 to 24 months of consistent, honest work. The first 3 months, recognition and initial confrontation with shadow material. This is often the most painful phase as denial breaks down. Months 4 to 8, active integration through imagination, ritual, and practice. The shadow begins to feel less threatening, more like reclaimed power. Months 9 to 12, differentiation skills develop. You can increasingly distinguish projection from reality. Months 13 to 24, relational repatterning and consolidation. New trust patterns replace old projection patterns. This isn't linear. Regression happens. You'll project again, catch it late, feel discouraged. Jung normalized this. Integration is spiral, not linear. Each time you recognize projection faster, that's progress. The integration endpoint. How do you know when integration is complete? Jung identified specific markers. You can acknowledge your capacity for betrayal, manipulation, and deception without feeling shame or needing to prove you're not that way. You can observe others' complex behaviors without intense emotional charge. You can extend trust when appropriate and withdraw it when warranted, based on evidence rather than fear. You can be vulnerable in relationships without constant surveillance or testing. You no longer feel morally superior to untrustworthy people. You understand their actions as human complexity rather than evil. Your nervous system has regained flexibility. You can relax in safe situations rather than constant hypervigilance. The ultimate marker, you can trust because you trust yourself to handle whatever comes, including betrayal. Not because betrayal doesn't hurt, but because you know you possess the inner resources, including your integrated shadow capacities, to protect, defend, rebuild, and discern wisely. This is mature trust, not naive, not defended, integrated, and it's available to anyone willing to face their shadow rather than continue projecting it onto the world. Jung believed that archetypal patterns play out across all of human history, that the same psychological dramas that occur in individual lives also manifest in the great stories and historical figures that capture human imagination. To understand the stakes of trust wound, integration versus failure, we need to look at actual lives where these patterns played out to their ultimate conclusions. Not theoretical cases, but real human beings whose choices to integrate or avoid their shadow determine the entire trajectory of their existence. Let's examine the devastating contrast between those who failed integration and those who succeeded, so you can see clearly which path you're currently walking. The failure case, King Lear and the tragedy of projected trust. Shakespeare's King Lear isn't just great literature, it's a perfect clinical case study of trustwound projection destroying everything it touches. Jung referenced Lear repeatedly in his work because the play demonstrates with brutal precision how shadow rejection creates catastrophic reality distortion. The setup is deceptively simple. Aging King Lear decides to divide his kingdom among his 3 daughters based on who can profess the greatest love for him. But watch what's actually happening through a Jungian lens. Lear has completely rejected his own shadow capacity for discernment. He's expelled the part of himself that can read genuine versus performative loyalty. Instead, he's created a testmaster archetype to determine trustworthiness. His daughters, Goneril and Regan, understand exactly what he wants. Flattery, performance, exaggerated declarations. They're strategic, socially intelligent, reading the situation and adjusting their presentations accordingly. They tell him elaborate lies about their devotion. His youngest daughter, Cordelia, refuses to play this game. She offers honest, measured love. I love you according to my bond, no more nor less. And Lear explodes. Here's the psychological truth Jung would identify. Lear banishes Cordelia not because she doesn't love him, but because her honesty confronts him with his own rejected shadow, the part of him that's been creating false loyalty tests, the part that wants performance over authenticity, the part that's suspicious of genuine love precisely because it doesn't meet his strategic criteria for proof. Cordelia's authenticity is unbearable because it reveals what Lear has disowned in himself, the capacity for genuine, uncalculated connection. So he trusts the manipulators, who are actually mirroring his own rejected strategic intelligence, and banishes the one person who loved him truly. What follows is the inevitable consequence of complete projection. Goneril and Regan, having secured their inheritance through performance, immediately reveal their actual natures, which, critically, aren't more evil than Lear's own shadow. They're strategic, self-interested, willing to use any means to secure power, exactly like Lear himself throughout his reign, but now directed against him. Lear experiences this as ultimate betrayal. How sharper than a serpent's tooth it is to have a thankless child. But Jung would ask, were they actually thankless, or were they simply beings as strategic and power-hungry as Lear himself had always been? But now Lear was no longer powerful enough to hide this quality in himself. The tragedy escalates. Lear descends into madness, not clinical psychosis, but the psychological fragmentation that results when your projections completely control reality and that reality collapses. He wanders the heath during a storm, raging at the heavens, finally beginning to glimpse the truth. I am a man more sinned against than sinning. But even here, notice the projection. He can't quite reach full self-awareness. He's still the victim in his narrative. The play ends in total destruction. Cordelia dies. The authentic love he rejected is lost forever. His kingdom is ruined. He dies in complete despair. This is what Jung meant by living in the shadow's prison until death. Lear's trust wound, his inability to receive genuine love, his need to test loyalty through performance, his rejection of his own strategic and power-hungry nature, created a self-fulfilling prophecy that destroyed literally everything he valued. The failure pattern is clear. Shadow rejection. Lear cannot own his capacity for strategic thinking and manipulation. Projection onto others. He sees these qualities in his daughters, but labels them differently depending on whether they flatter him. Reality distortion through projection. He trusts liars and banishes truth-tellers. Self-fulfilling prophecy. His projections create the exact betrayal he feared. Complete destruction, psychological fragmentation, loss of everything meaningful, death in despair. Jung asked his patients who identified with feeling betrayed, "Are you Lear? Are you creating your own storm?" The success case, Nelson Mandela, and the integration of the shadow warrior. Now let's examine the opposite trajectory. Someone who faced their shadow, integrated it, and transformed potential paranoia into wisdom. Nelson Mandela spent 27 years in prison, subjected to brutal conditions, separated from his family, watching his movement suppressed and his people oppressed. If anyone had justification for Trustwound development, it was Mandela. He'd been betrayed by the apartheid government that imprisoned him. He'd been betrayed by informants within his own organization. He'd been betrayed by the international community that took decades to meaningfully oppose apartheid. Every condition was present for him to develop the betrayal prophet or hypervigilant protector pattern, to emerge from prison convinced that trust was impossible, that violence was the only solution, that his oppressors could never be partners in reconciliation. This is exactly what happened to many of his fellow activists. They emerged from similar experiences filled with justified rage, unable to trust, committed to revolution through any means necessary. But Mandela did something different, something that Jung would recognize as profound shadow integration work. During his imprisonment, Mandela didn't suppress his rage, his desire for revenge, or his capacity for violence. He acknowledged these qualities completely. He wrote about understanding the urge to become what you fight against, to adopt your oppressor's methods, to let hatred consume you. But instead of rejecting these shadow qualities, he consciously integrated them. There's a documented moment that captures this perfectly. Mandela taught himself Afrikaans, the language of his oppressors, in prison. He studied Afrikaner history, culture, poetry. His fellow prisoners thought he was collaborating with the enemy. But Mandela understood something crucial. To transform his enemies into partners, he had to understand them from within. Not to excuse their violence, but to see them as complete humans with their own fears, shadows, and capacities for transformation. This is shadow integration applied at the collective level. Mandela owned his capacity for hatred. He owned his capacity for violence. He owned his warrior energy, the part of him that could absolutely destroy his oppressors if he chose. But by consciously owning these capacities, he could choose how to deploy them. The warrior energy didn't have to express as violence. It could express as strategic negotiation, firm boundaries, refusal to be victimized, without projecting enemy onto the other side in a way that made reconciliation impossible. When Mandela was finally released and became president, his first major act was inviting his former prison guards to his inauguration as honored guests. This wasn't naive forgiveness. It was integrated discernment. Mandela could trust his former oppressors to participate in building a new South Africa precisely because he'd integrated his own shadow warrior. He knew when to be fierce, when to be conciliatory, when to hold boundaries, and when to extend trust. Because these weren't projections, they were conscious choices. The contrast with Lear is total. Shadow acknowledgement. Mandela consciously owned his capacity for hatred, violence, and revenge. Integration rather than projection. He understood his enemies as humans with similar capacities, not as externalized evil. Reality creation through consciousness. He created partnership possibilities rather than self-fulfilling prophecies of betrayal. Transformation of self and systems. His integration made collective healing possible. Legacy of meaning. He died having transformed an entire nation's trajectory toward reconciliation. Jung's principle is demonstrated perfectly. When you integrate your shadow, you gain the capacity for mature trust because you trust yourself to handle complexity, including betrayal, without fragmenting. Mandela could trust his former oppressors not because they'd earned it by some objective standard, but because he trusted himself, his integrated warrior, his discernment, his capacity to respond appropriately whether they honored the trust or violated it. Additional contrast, Howard Hughes versus Maya Angelou. Let's examine one more powerful contrast that demonstrates these patterns in different contexts. Howard Hughes, the fortress that became a prison. Hughes was one of the most brilliant and successful businessmen of the 20th century, but he also embodied the emotional fortress and hyper-vigilant protector archetypes in their most extreme forms. Early betrayals, business partners who tried to exploit him, romantic relationships that targeted his wealth, triggered a progressive shadow rejection pattern. Hughes couldn't consciously own his own predatory business instincts. He'd ruthlessly destroyed competitors, his own manipulative capacities in relationships, or his own selfishness in prioritizing empire building over human connection. Instead, he projected these qualities onto everyone around him. Business associates were all trying to steal from him. Romantic partners were all gold diggers. Employees were all plotting against him. The projections intensified over decades. Hughes built more elaborate security systems. He isolated himself more completely. He tested everyone more rigorously. By the end of his life, Hughes lived in complete isolation in sealed hotel rooms, refusing to let anyone touch him, convinced of conspiracies everywhere, his brilliant mind consumed by paranoid projections. He died alone, psychologically fragmented, his vast wealth unable to purchase the one thing he'd made impossible through shadow rejection: genuine human connection. The trust wound had metastasized until it consumed his entire reality. Maya Angelou, From Trauma to Integration. Maya Angelou experienced devastating early betrayal. She was raped at age 8 by her mother's boyfriend. After she testified against him, he was murdered, likely by her uncles. Angelou stopped speaking for 5 years, convinced her words had killed him. This is severe trauma that could have created permanent trust wound patterns, and initially it did. Angelou described her younger self as unable to trust anyone, building walls, becoming the emotional fortress. But through decades of conscious work, therapy, mentorship, spiritual practice, and what Jung would recognize as shadow integration, Angelou transformed. She owned her rage. She owned her capacity for violence. She worked as a madam and dealt with dangerous people. She owned her manipulative intelligence. She was a performer, dancer, and coordinator who had to understand human psychology deeply. Instead of rejecting these shadow qualities, she consciously integrated them and channeled them into art, activism, and ultimately into a life characterized by profound human connection despite her trauma. Angelou's later life was defined by her capacity to trust appropriately, to form deep friendships, to mentor young people, to collaborate on major projects, precisely because she'd integrated her shadow. She could discern real threats because she understood manipulation from the inside. She could extend trust because she trusted herself to handle betrayal without fragmenting. She famously said, "When someone shows you who they are, believe them the first time." This isn't paranoia, it's integrated discernment. She's not projecting enemy onto everyone. She's calmly observing actual behavior and responding appropriately. The contrast between Hughes and Angelou is perfect. Both experienced betrayal. Both had legitimate reasons for trust wounds. But Hughes rejected his shadow and spent his life in projected paranoia, while Angelou integrated her shadow and lived a life of meaning, connection, and legacy. The pattern is clear. Across history, across cultures, across personal and collective scales, the pattern Jung identified plays out identically. Shadow rejection plus projection, progressive isolation, reality distortion, and life destruction. Shadow integration, discernment, appropriate trust, meaningful connection, and transformative legacy. You're living one of these patterns right now. The question is, which ending are you creating? Jung didn't develop his theories about shadow projection from a position of detached academic observation. He developed them while crawling through his own psychological hell, a years-long crisis that nearly destroyed him and that he documented in what would become his most mysterious and powerful work, the Red Book. Understanding Jung's personal descent into Trustwound territory isn't just biographical interest. It's essential because it proves that even the master of shadow work wasn't immune to the very patterns he would later help others navigate. And his journey through this crisis provides the template for anyone facing their own shadow integration. The break with Freud, the betrayal that triggered everything. In 1913, Jung's relationship with Sigmund Freud, his mentor, father figure, and collaborative partner, collapsed completely. The professional break was about theoretical differences. Freud insisted on the primacy of sexual drives in all psychology. Jung had developed a broader view of the psyche that included spiritual and archetypal dimensions. But the psychological break was far more devastating. Freud had represented for Jung the possibility of genuine intellectual partnership, of trust-based collaboration, where two brilliant minds could build something larger than either could alone. When that relationship ended, with mutual accusations, bitter letters, and what Jung experienced as profound betrayal, something shattered in Jung's psychic structure. And here's what makes Jung's crisis so relevant to Trustwound psychology. Jung didn't just feel hurt by Freud's rejection. He began to distrust his own unconscious. The break triggered a cascade of overwhelming visions, voices, and autonomous psychic material that Jung feared might be early psychosis. He documented feeling like he was going mad, losing his grip on consensual reality, unable to trust whether his inner experiences were prophetic wisdom or pathological delusion. This is Trustwound psychology turned inward. Jung couldn't trust himself, his own perceptions, his own unconscious processes. The man who would become the world's foremost expert on the psyche spent years terrified of his own depths, suspicious of his own inner voices, convinced his unconscious might be a malevolent force trying to destroy his sanity. The shadow Jung had rejected. Through his later analysis of this period, Jung realized what he'd done. He'd rejected his own prophetic and visionary capacities as potentially pathological. He'd internalized Freud's scientific materialism to such a degree that when his own psyche started producing mythological, archetypal, and spiritual material, Jung's first response was to label it as dangerous. He'd split his psyche into rational Jung, acceptable, scientific, trustworthy, and visionary Jung, suspicious, potentially mad, dangerous. This is the same split his patients experienced, rejecting a part of themselves, then experiencing that rejected part as threatening other. For Jung, the threatening other was his own unconscious, which had become so autonomous and powerful that it was invading his consciousness with material he couldn't control. The paranoia his patients felt toward external people, Jung felt toward his internal processes. Every vision, every voice, every symbolic image that emerged from his unconscious triggered the same question his trust-wounded patients asked about people. Can I trust this? Is this trying to help me or destroy me? Should I open to it or defend against it? The Descent, October 1913. Jung documented the beginning of his crisis with clinical precision, even as he was living through it. An incessant stream of fantasies had been released, and I did my best not to lose my head, but to find some way to understand these strange things. I stood helpless before an alien world. Everything in it seemed difficult and incomprehensible. The visions were overwhelming. He saw Europe flooded with blood. He heard voices speaking in languages he didn't know. He encountered autonomous psychic figures who seemed to have their own agendas, their own wisdom, their own demands. Most destabilizing, he encountered parts of himself he'd completely rejected as unacceptable. There was Philemon, a figure that appeared repeatedly in visions, an old man with a white beard and wings of a kingfisher. Philemon represented Jung's own projected spiritual wisdom and authority that he'd given to Freud and other external authorities rather than owning as his own. There was Salome, representing Jung's rejected feminine, intuitive, feeling aspects that his rational, scientific identity had dismissed. There were darker figures too, shadow elements representing Jung's capacity for grandiosity, his desire for power, his Nietzschean will to dominate intellectually. Every figure represented a rejected or projected aspect of Jung's own psyche, now appearing as seemingly autonomous entities. And Jung's response was initially the same as any trust-wounded patient. Can I trust these figures? Are they trying to help or harm me? If I open to them, will they destroy my sanity? The integration decision, the turning point in Jung's crisis, came when he made a conscious choice that would define his entire therapeutic methodology. He decided to trust the process rather than continue defending against it. This wasn't naive trust. It was strategic trust grounded in desperate necessity. Nothing else was working. Fighting the visions only intensified them. Trying to suppress them only made them more autonomous and threatening. So Jung did something radical. He began dialoguing with the figures rather than trying to escape them. He entered into what he would later call active imagination, consciously engaging with autonomous psychic content as if it were a real conversation partner. The results were documented in the Red Book, hundreds of pages of conversations between Jung and his shadow figures, each dialogue revealing aspects of himself he'd rejected and now needed to integrate. One of the most powerful dialogues was with Philemon, where Jung gradually realized this wise old man wasn't an external spirit or a symptom of madness. It was Jung's own rejected wisdom, his own spiritual authority, his own prophetic insight that he'd been afraid to claim. By projecting all wisdom onto Freud, Jung had made himself helpless when that relationship ended. Reclaiming Philemon meant owning, I am capable of profound spiritual insight. I am a prophet and visionary. I don't need external authorization for my visions. They're mine. This terrified Jung because claiming such authority felt grandiose, inflated, potentially mad. But Jung discovered the paradox. The real madness was in the split. As long as he rejected his visionary capacity, it would haunt him as potentially psychotic. When he consciously owned it, integrated it, and brought it under ethical and intellectual discipline, it became his greatest gift. The trust wound applied to Jung's crisis demonstrates something crucial for anyone with trust wounds. The pattern works identically whether you're projecting onto others or onto parts of yourself. Trust-wounded people who can't trust others are often simultaneously unable to trust themselves, their intuitions, their inner wisdom, their capacity to handle challenges. They project untrustworthy onto internal impulses, just as they projected onto external people. Can I trust this feeling, or is it just my trauma? Can I trust this intuition, or am I being paranoid? Can I trust my desire for connection, or am I being naive? The same hypervigilance, the same testing, the same need for proof, all directed inward. Jung's breakthrough was realizing that the solution for internal trust wounds is the same as for external ones, integration rather than rejection. You don't heal by learning to blindly trust your impulses. You heal by consciously owning all your capacities, including destructive ones, so that you can discern which impulses serve wholeness and which serve fragmentation. The integration process, 1913–1919. Jung spent 6 years in intensive shadow integration work, documented across the pages of the Red Book. The process wasn't linear. He had periods of breakthrough followed by periods of terror. He integrated one shadow figure only to have another appear. He questioned his sanity repeatedly, even while continuing to see patients and maintain his professional life. But gradually the transformation occurred. The visions didn't stop, but they became less threatening because Jung had stopped fighting them. Instead of autonomous invasions, they became dialogues. Instead of symptoms of madness, they became sources of wisdom. Jung integrated his prophetic capacity by owning, yes, I see things others don't. Yes, I have access to archetypal knowledge. This isn't madness if I remain grounded and ethical. He integrated his power drive by owning, yes, I want influence and authority. Yes, I have grandiose aspects, but conscious grandiosity under ethical guidance is different from unconscious inflation. He integrated his feminine and feeling aspects by engaging deeply with Salome and other anima figures, learning to trust emotion and intuition alongside intellect. Most importantly, he learned to trust his unconscious, not as a malevolent force, but as a compensatory, self-regulating system, one that would always present him with exactly what consciousness had rejected and needed to integrate. The emergence of trust. By 1919, Jung had emerged from his crisis fundamentally transformed. He hadn't become naive. If anything, his understanding of the psyche's complexity and potential dangers had deepened. But he'd developed something crucial: mature trust in the individuation process itself. He could now trust that whatever emerged from the unconscious, however terrifying, however challenging, was ultimately in service of wholeness. This is the exact transformation he would later guide his trust-wounded patients toward. You don't learn to trust by pretending threats don't exist. You learn to trust by integrating your shadow so completely that you can handle whatever comes, including betrayal, including disappointment, including your own capacity for both destruction and creation. Jung wrote later, "The man who cannot trust his unconscious cannot trust his own mind, and a man who cannot trust his own mind can trust nothing at all. Not himself, not others, not life." This was personal testimony. He'd lived the terror of self-distrust. He'd integrated it, and he'd emerged able to trust not because the world was safe, but because he'd become complete. The gift of the crisis. Jung's breakdown became his breakthrough, the source material for every therapeutic technique he would develop. Active imagination came from his dialogue with Philemon. Shadow work came from his integration of rejected psychic figures. His understanding of projection came from recognizing how he'd projected his wisdom onto Freud. His concept of the self as the organizing principle of wholeness came from experiencing the chaos that results when consciousness loses connection with the unconscious. Without his trust wound crisis, without the years of terrifying confrontation with his own projected shadows, Jung would have remained a talented Freudian analyst, but never become the Jung we know. The crisis was the curriculum, and this is the promise he offers anyone in the midst of trust wound suffering. Your crisis isn't a mistake. It's not evidence that you're broken beyond repair. It's the psyche's desperate attempt to force integration, to show you the rejected parts of yourself, to make wholeness possible. The terror you feel when you can't trust, Whether you're projecting onto others or onto your own inner processes is actually the terror of the ego facing the shadow. And on the other side of that terror, if you have the courage to keep moving through it rather than building higher walls against it, is the integrated self Jung discovered, capable of mature trust because you've reclaimed your wholeness, capable of discernment because you understand complexity from within, capable of authentic connection because you've stopped projecting shadows and started encountering actual humans. Jung's crisis proves what he would later teach. The darkest night of your soul is actually your shadow demanding integration. The question isn't whether you'll survive it. The question is whether you'll use it, as Jung did, as the raw material for your own transformation from fragmented distrust into integrated wholeness. Jung's therapeutic insights are powerful, but they're useless without practical implementation. Understanding that you project your shadow onto others doesn't automatically stop the projection. Knowing intellectually that your distrust reveals rejected aspects of yourself doesn't spontaneously integrate those aspects. Integration requires daily practice, concrete, repeatable techniques that gradually shift the unconscious patterns that have controlled your reality for years or decades. This section provides 7 practical tools Jung developed and that his patients used successfully to reclaim trust through shadow integration. These aren't theoretical exercises. They're proven methodologies that work if you actually do them rather than just reading about them. Tool 1. The Projection Journal, 15 minutes daily. This is the foundation practice that must be maintained throughout your integration work. The practice. Every evening before sleep, spend 15 minutes reviewing your day and documenting every instance where you felt distrust, suspicion, or the urge to test someone. Use this exact template. Date, today's date, person, situation, who triggered distrust, what was happening, what I accused them of, internally or externally, manipulative, dishonest, selfish, etc. Physical sensation. Where in my body did I feel this? How did it feel? The story my mind created. What narrative did I generate about their intentions? My response. What did I actually do? Test them, withdraw, surveil. Then, and this is crucial, add this final question. Shadow reflection. How might I possess the exact quality I attributed to them? This last question is where the real work happens. Force yourself to answer it honestly, even when every fiber of your being wants to insist, no, they really were being manipulative. Example, entry, person. My partner asked why I seemed distant lately, what I accused them of, trying to guilt trip me, making me feel bad for having boundaries. Physical sensation, tight chest, clenched jaw, heat in my face. The story, they're trying to control me through emotional manipulation. They can't handle me being independent. My response, I got defensive and changed the subject. Shadow reflection. I am actually the one using emotional distance as manipulation, withdrawing as punishment when I feel threatened. I accused them of guilt tripping when really I was feeling guilty for my own withdrawal pattern. The goal, after 30 days of consistent journaling, patterns become undeniable. You'll see the same accusations appearing repeatedly, pointing directly to your most rejected shadow qualities. The journal transforms unconscious projection into visible patterns you can no longer deny. Tool 2. The Betrayer Meditation, 20 minutes 3x weekly. This active imagination practice involves consciously embodying your rejected shadow, the betrayer, manipulator, or abandoner you've been projecting onto others. The practice. Find a quiet space where you won't be interrupted. This works best early morning or late evening when the unconscious is more accessible. Close your eyes and take several deep breaths. Then consciously invoke your shadow figure, the personification of the qualities you've been projecting. Some people visualize this figure, others simply sense a presence. Don't force it, let it emerge naturally. Once you feel the presence, speak out loud or write from the shadow's perspective. Use first person. Give it full permission to express itself without censorship. Start with, I am the part of your name that... Example, I am the part of Sarah that knows exactly how to manipulate social situations to my advantage. I can read people instantly, their weaknesses, their desires, their vulnerabilities. I know how to say exactly what they want to hear. I know when to withhold information, when to reveal it, how to position myself for maximum benefit. Sarah calls me manipulative and tries to pretend I don't exist. But I'm her intelligence, her social wisdom, her survival instinct. Every time she accuses someone else of being strategic, she's really seeing me and hating what she sees. I don't want to destroy her. I want to serve her consciously. I want her to own that being strategic isn't evil, it's powerful. I want her to stop projecting me onto everyone else and finally let me help her navigate reality with wisdom instead of paranoia. The goal. By embodying the shadow rather than rejecting it, you begin to experience these qualities as aspects of yourself rather than threats from others. The practice gradually dissolves the split between conscious self and projected shadow. Tool 3. Dream incubation for trust shadows, nightly. Jung believed dreams were the psyche's natural integration mechanism, the nightly presentation of exactly what consciousness needs to see, but has been avoiding. The practice. Every night before sleep, consciously request dreams that reveal your Trustwound shadow material. Place a journal and pen beside your bed, not your phone. The blue light disrupts the liminal state necessary for dream recall. As you're falling asleep, repeat this specific intention. Show me the parts of myself I've been projecting onto others. Reveal my rejected capacities for betrayal, manipulation, abandonment. Let me see my own face in the mirror. The moment you wake, before moving, before checking your phone, before engaging conscious thinking, immediately record whatever you remember, no matter how fragmentary. What to look for. Pay special attention to dreams where you're being chased or threatened by a figure who turns out to have your face. Someone you trust betrays you. This is often your psyche showing you your own rejected betrayer. You're the one doing the betraying. These dreams are gold. They're direct shadow presentation. Figures appear who possess qualities you accuse others of having. Example. One patient, Marcus, repeatedly dreamed of being pursued by a man in a business suit who was trying to sell him something. Marcus would run, hide, feel threatened. After 3 weeks of dream incubation work, the dream shifted. Marcus turned to face the salesman and saw his own face. In the dream, the salesman said, I'm not here to trick you. I'm your ability to persuade, to present ideas compellingly, to influence outcomes. You've called me manipulative because you're terrified of your own power. Stop running and let me serve you consciously. Marcus woke with the recognition that his entire career had been limited by his rejection of his natural persuasive gifts, which he'd labeled as manipulation and projected onto every colleague who successfully advanced. Tool 4. The opposite day practice, once weekly. This practice involves deliberately acting opposite to your trust wound pattern for 1 full day, proving to yourself that the catastrophe you fear won't actually occur. The practice. Choose 1 day per week for the next 8 weeks. Each week, you'll practice the opposite of your habitual trust wound response. If you're a fortress guardian, ask for help 3 times in 1 day. Express a need. Admit you can't do something alone. If you're a test master, accept someone's word at face value without verification or testing. When they say something, consciously choose to believe them without gathering evidence. If you're hypervigilant, practice conscious relaxation of scanning. When you notice yourself analyzing someone's motives, deliberately let it go and stay present instead. If you're a betrayal prophet, when you feel the familiar "they're going to leave" feeling, consciously move toward the person instead of withdrawing. Express vulnerability instead of preemptive distance. If you're a wounded sage, find one situation where you choose hope or trust without cynical analysis. Act as if goodness is possible. The goal: this isn't about permanently adopting the opposite position. It's about proving to your nervous system that you can survive without your defenses. The catastrophe you fear, complete vulnerability leading to certain betrayal, doesn't actually happen. Most importantly, you'll notice that acting opposite to your pattern doesn't feel good initially. It feels terrifying. That terror is your shadow screaming, "Don't integrate me. I'm supposed to stay rejected." Sitting with that terror and discovering you survive it is the integration work itself. Tool 5, Mirror Confrontation Ritual, weekly. This is one of Jung's most powerful but underutilized techniques, literally using a physical mirror to confront your projected shadow. The practice: stand before a full-length mirror in private. Look directly at your reflection without avoiding your own gaze. Speak to your reflection as if it's the untrustworthy person you've been projecting onto. Accuse your reflection of everything you've been accusing others of. You're manipulative. You can't be trusted. You're dishonest. You have hidden agendas. You're going to betray me. You're selfish and calculating. Say all of it. Let the projection fully express toward your own reflection. Then, this is the crucial part: switch roles. Respond as yourself to these accusations. Defend yourself, but do so by owning the qualities rather than denying them. Yes, I am capable of manipulation when I need to be. Yes, I have agendas that I don't always reveal. Yes, I am strategic and sometimes dishonest. Yes, I could betray someone if circumstances pushed me far enough. I am all of these things, and I am also capable of loyalty, honesty, and care. I am complex, and I'm finally ready to own all of it. The goal: this ritual breaks the projection by forcing you to simultaneously accuse and embody. The mind can't maintain the split when you're literally looking at your own face while making the accusation. Patients report that this exercise initially feels absurd or impossible, but by the third or fourth session, something shifts. A visceral recognition that you've been accusing yourself all along. Tool 6, Radical Honesty Experiments, Daily Micro-Practices. Jung discovered that integration requires actually expressing shadow qualities in small, ethical ways, proving to yourself that you can own these capacities without becoming monstrous. The practice: each day, consciously practice small acts of the qualities you've been rejecting. Strategic thinking. In one conversation, consciously consider what you'll reveal versus what you'll withhold. Make this choice deliberately rather than automatically. Necessary deception. Identify one situation where complete honesty would be harmful, not convenient, actually harmful, and practice appropriate withholding. Own that you're doing it. Boundary setting through distance. When someone's energy feels draining, consciously choose to create space. Don't pretend you're just busy. Internally acknowledge, "I'm choosing distance right now." Self-interested action. Do something purely for yourself without justifying it as for others' benefit. Own your selfishness without shame. The key phrase for all of these: I am choosing to quality right now, and that's okay. The goal: these micro-practices destigmatize shadow qualities by showing you that strategic thinking, necessary deception, boundary setting, and self-interest aren't actually evil. They're neutral human capacities that become ethical or unethical depending on consciousness and intention. As you practice them consciously, they lose their terrifying quality. They become tools you can use wisely rather than capacities you must reject and project. Tool 7. Gratitude for Betrayal, Monthly Reflection. This is the most advanced practice, appropriate only after several months of the other tools have created some integration foundation. The practice. Once per month, write a letter of gratitude to someone who betrayed you. But you'll never send this letter. It's purely for your own integration work. The template. Dear person, thank you for betraying me. I thought your betrayal was about you, but I now understand it was a mirror showing me my own rejected shadow. What you did that hurt me, specific behavior, what this revealed about my shadow, the quality in myself I couldn't see, how this betrayal served my integration, what you learned, reclaimed. I release you from being the carrier of my projection. I reclaim the shadow material you were reflecting. Example, Dear Michael, thank you for leaving our business partnership so abruptly. I thought you were selfish, dishonest, and disloyal. Now I see. You were showing me my own capacity to prioritize myself, to leave situations that don't serve me, to put my growth above loyalty to stagnant arrangements. I'd rejected my own selfishness so completely that I couldn't recognize when our partnership had become stagnant. You had the courage to leave. I was waiting for you to be the bad guy, so I wouldn't have to face that I wanted to leave too. Thank you for carrying my shadow until I was ready to reclaim it. The goal. This practice completes the integration cycle by transforming the betrayer from enemy into teacher. It doesn't condone actual harmful behavior. It reclaims your projection so you're free. Jung understood that transformation doesn't happen linearly. It follows the archetypal pattern humanity has always recognized. The hero's journey. Your trust wound healing isn't a clinical process. It's a heroic quest through the underworld of your own shadow, with stages that are predictable, necessary, and ultimately triumphant if you keep moving forward. Understanding this arc helps you recognize where you are in the journey and what's coming next, normalizing the difficulty while maintaining hope that there is another side. Let's map the complete transformation arc so you know exactly what to expect as you move from trust wound suffering to integrated wholeness. Stage 1. The call, crisis of isolation. Every hero's journey begins with a call, the moment when your current existence becomes unbearable and change becomes necessary rather than optional. For trust wound healing, the call typically comes as a crisis of isolation. A relationship that could have been meaningful collapses under the weight of your testing and surveillance, and this time, unlike previous times, you can't convince yourself it was entirely their fault. Or you find yourself alone on a significant life milestone, birthday, holiday, achievement, and suddenly the isolation you've been calling independence reveals itself as the prison it actually is. Or you catch yourself in a moment of brutal honesty. I've destroyed every intimate relationship I've had. The common denominator is me. Or your body forces the recognition through breakdown, chronic anxiety, depression that won't lift, physical illness that stems from nervous system dysregulation caused by constant hypervigilance. The call isn't gentle. It's the psyche screaming, "This isn't working. You're dying inside. Something has to change." Jung observed that many people receive this call repeatedly throughout their lives but refuse it each time, instead doubling down on their defenses. I just need to be more careful about who I let in. The right person will understand my need for proof. I'm better off alone anyway. But eventually, for those who will transform, the call becomes undeniable. The pain of staying the same finally exceeds the terror of changing. The recognition moment. What distinguishes those who answer the call from those who refuse it? a single moment of devastating self-recognition where you glimpse your own role in your isolation. I'm not just cautious, I'm impossible to connect with. I don't just have boundaries, I have walls that no genuine love could ever penetrate. I'm not protecting myself, I'm slowly suffocating myself. This recognition moment is excruciatingly painful because it shatters the narrative you've used to maintain your pattern, that you're the victim, that others are the problem, that your distrust is wisdom rather than wound. But within this pain is the seed of transformation. You can't heal what you can't see. The call forces you to see. Stage 2. Refusal and resistance. The dark night. Jung was realistic about the hero's journey. He knew that accepting the call isn't a single decision, but a process that includes intense resistance. After the initial recognition, the ego mobilizes every defense it has to avoid the terrifying work of shadow integration, the evidence offensive. Your mind generates renewed proof that others really are untrustworthy. You suddenly remember every betrayal, see articles about infidelity and fraud, encounter stories that confirm your worldview. The ego is desperately trying to rebuild the case that projection is reality, the fear intensification. As you contemplate opening up or trusting again, your nervous system floods with panic. Every cell screams, "Danger! This is how we got hurt before. Abort, retreat." The spiritual bypass attempt. Some people try to skip the hard work through affirmations and forced positivity. I'm just going to choose to trust. But without shadow integration, this collapses quickly because the unconscious pattern remains intact. The relationship sabotage. Ironically, this stage often includes the most destructive behavior toward the few people who've remained in your life. You unconsciously escalate your testing and surveillance, as if trying to force them to betray you and prove that transformation isn't necessary. Jung called this stage the dark night, the period where you know you need to change but feel utterly incapable of doing so. You're caught between two impossibilities. You can't continue as you are, but you can't imagine how to be different. The crucial choice. This stage is where most people turn back. The resistance feels insurmountable. The fear feels too great. They decide that their trust wound is simply who they are and resign themselves to isolation. But for those who will complete the journey, something shifts. Desperation becomes stronger than fear. You make the decision Jung knew was prerequisite to all transformation. I don't know if this will work, but staying here is definitely killing me. I have to try. This isn't confident commitment. It's terrified surrender. But it's enough to move you to the next stage. Stage 3. Meeting the shadow guide. First recognition. In every hero's journey, there's a moment when you meet the guide who can help you through the ordeal. Gandalf, Yoda, the wise mentor. In shadow work, the guide isn't external. It's the first genuine encounter with your own shadow, the moment you glimpse your face in the mirror rather than projecting it onto others. This happens differently for different people. For some, it's a dream that's too obvious to ignore, where you're literally the betrayer, and you wake with the undeniable knowing, that was me. That's what I've been projecting. For others, it's a therapeutic breakthrough where a skilled therapist or guide holds up the mirror. Notice what you just did. You accused them of exactly what you're doing right now. For others still, it's a moment in a relationship where someone you trust risks the brutal truth. You test everyone, you surveil everyone, you make connection impossible. And I think you know this, even if you won't admit it. The shadow recognition. When you truly meet your shadow guide, when you glimpse your own capacity for the qualities you've been projecting, the experience is both terrifying and liberating. Terrifying because your entire self-concept is threatened. If you're capable of betrayal, manipulation, or abandonment, then who are you? The good person identity you've clung to crumbles, but also liberating because for the first time, the world makes sense differently. You realize, the reason I saw manipulation everywhere is because I'm brilliant at reading social dynamics, which I'd labeled as evil. The reason I detected dishonesty constantly is because I understand how deception works from the inside. The reason I expected abandonment is because I'd already abandoned myself. This recognition brings a strange kind of peace, the peace of finally seeing the truth after years of exhausting distortion. The dialogue begins. Jung taught that meeting your shadow isn't a one-time event. It's the beginning of an ongoing relationship. You start dialoguing with your shadow, asking questions, listening to its perspective. And crucially, you begin to understand that what you called evil is actually power, wisdom, capability that you'd rejected as morally unacceptable. The shadow guide shows you the path forward. Integration rather than rejection, consciousness rather than projection, wholeness rather than fragmentation. Stage 4, the ordeal of integration, the harrowing. This is the longest and most difficult stage, the months or years where you're actively doing the integration work, and everything feels worse before it gets better. Jung called this the harrowing because it feels like your entire psychic structure is being torn apart and rebuilt. The grief wave. Early in this stage comes profound grief, not just for what was done to you, but for what you did to yourself and others through your projections. You grieve the relationships you destroyed through testing and surveillance. You grieve the decades spent in isolation you called wisdom. You grieve the parts of yourself you violently rejected and how much suffering that rejection caused. This grief is necessary. It's the mourning of your old identity, the self that organized around the wound. That self has to die for the integrated self to be born. The projection lift. As you do the daily shadow work, something unsettling happens. You stop seeing enemies everywhere. The people you were convinced were manipulative suddenly just look like complex humans trying to protect themselves. The betrayals you were certain were coming start seeming less inevitable. This should feel like relief, but initially it feels like loss. Your projections, despite being painful, were organizing your reality. Without them, you temporarily feel disoriented, unable to make sense of the world. The conscious embodiment. This stage requires you to consciously practice the qualities you'd rejected. You experiment with being strategic in conversations and discover it doesn't make you evil, it makes you effective. You practice appropriate withholding and learn that discretion isn't dishonesty, it's wisdom. You set boundaries through withdrawal and realize that creating space isn't abandonment, it's self-respect. Each time you consciously embody a shadow quality, without becoming monstrous, you prove to yourself that integration is possible. The relationship crisis. Ironically, as you integrate your shadow, your existing relationships may destabilize. People who were stable as long as you carried their projections too become uncomfortable when you stop playing that role. Partners who appreciated your hypervigilance because it matched their own anxiety feel threatened when you become more relaxed. Some relationships end during this stage, not because integration is wrong, but because they were built on mutual projection rather than genuine connection. This is excruciating, but Jung insisted it's necessary. You can't build a new self on the foundation of the old one. Sometimes the entire structure has to be dismantled. The ego-death experience. The peak of this stage involves what feels like ego death, the complete collapse of your previous identity. You're no longer the person who doesn't trust easily, which was secretly an identity of superiority. But you're not yet the person who trusts maturely. You're in between, formless, undefined, terrified. Jung documented this experience in his own Red Book crisis. He called it standing at the abyss, the moment where you've let go of your defenses but haven't yet built integrated wholeness. This is the most dangerous moment in the journey. Many people panic here and rebuild their defenses even higher than before, now with an added layer. I tried to change and it only made things worse. My distrust was right all along. But if you can stay with the groundlessness, if you can tolerate the terror of not knowing who you are for a while, something miraculous begins to happen. Stage 5. Rebirth into mature trust, emergence. After months or years in the ordeal, a shift occurs that Jung described as rebirth, not as metaphor, but as lived phenomenological reality. You wake up one day and realize, I'm different. Something fundamental has changed. The physiological shift. Your nervous system has regained flexibility. You can relax in safe situations rather than constant scanning. When real threats appear, you respond appropriately rather than with the same intensity you'd apply to everything. Your body feels different, less armored, more available, capable of pleasure and connection without the constant undercurrent of vigilance. The perceptual transformation. The way you see people has fundamentally altered. You no longer see humans as either trustworthy or untrustworthy. You see complex beings with mixed motivations, capable of both care and harm, just like you. You can observe someone's manipulative behavior without the intense emotional charge because you've owned your own capacity for manipulation. You see their deception without needing to prosecute them because you understand deception as a human survival mechanism. Most surprisingly, you can receive genuine love when it's offered. The walls have come down enough that care can actually reach you. The discernment capacity. Here's the paradox of integrated trust. You become both more trusting and more discerning simultaneously. You can extend appropriate trust in appropriate contexts because you're not operating from blanket fear, but you can also identify real threats more accurately because you understand human complexity from the inside. You trust not because you're naive about betrayal, but because you trust yourself to handle betrayal without fragmenting. Someone could hurt you, and you know you'd survive it. You'd set boundaries, you'd leave if necessary. You'd grieve and heal and rebuild, so you're free to risk connection. The relationship transformation. If you're in a relationship during this stage, your partner witnesses a profound shift. You stop testing them. The surveillance ends. The need for constant proof disappears. Instead, you're present, relaxed, able to receive their love and give yours freely. If you're single, you notice yourself attracted to different people, not the ones who trigger your wound, which used to feel like chemistry, but people who are actually capable of mature connection. The identity integration. You've integrated the paradox. You are capable of betrayal and worthy of trust. You possess strategic intelligence and genuine care. You can be self-interested and deeply connected. The split is healed. The war between conscious self and shadow self has ended in reconciliation rather than victory for either side. Jung called this integration individuation, becoming the person you actually are rather than the defended fragment you'd been forced to become. Stage 6. Return with the gift, service to others. The hero's journey doesn't end with personal transformation. It culminates in returning to the ordinary world with gifts to share. For those who've integrated their Trustwound shadow, the gift is profound. You can hold space for others' projections without taking them personally. When someone projects their shadow onto you, accuses you of untrustworthiness, tests you, surveys you, you recognize what's happening. You don't retaliate or collapse. You hold steady, perhaps gently mirroring back what you see. You can model mature trust. Others watch you extend appropriate trust, set boundaries without aggression. handle betrayal without fragmenting, and they glimpse that another way is possible. You can guide others through their shadow work, having walked the path yourself. You know the stages, the pitfalls, the moments of despair that actually indicate progress. You become the shadow guide for others that you needed when you were in the ordeal. This return stage isn't about becoming a therapist, though some do. It's about living in a way that demonstrates integration is possible, that trust wounds don't have to be permanent prisons. Your very existence becomes evidence that transformation is real. The ongoing journey. Jung was clear that individuation isn't a destination, it's a lifelong process. You don't complete shadow work and never project again, but you develop meta-awareness. When you do project, and you will, you catch it faster. You recognize the signature more quickly. You take responsibility more readily. The projections that used to last months or years now last days or hours. The relationships that used to be destroyed by your defenses now bend and recover. You've moved from unconscious projection to conscious integration, and that makes all the difference. Jung watched hundreds of patients attempt shadow integration. He witnessed both triumphant transformations and catastrophic failures. The difference, he discovered, wasn't willingness or intelligence. It was whether people avoided specific, predictable pitfalls that can make shadow work go dangerously wrong. Understanding these traps before you encounter them is crucial. Shadow work isn't inherently safe. Done poorly, it can create worse problems than the original trust wound. Let's examine the 5 major pitfalls with brutal honesty, so you can navigate around them rather than discovering them the hard way. Pitfall 1. Shadow inflation, becoming the betrayer. This is the most common and most dangerous trap, mistaking shadow recognition for shadow identification. What it looks like. You begin shadow work and have the crucial recognition: I am capable of manipulation, betrayal, strategic deception. But instead of integrating this awareness as one aspect of your complex humanity, you flip entirely to the opposite pole. You become identified with the shadow you'd been rejecting. I was naive to think trust was real. Everyone's manipulative, and now that I've owned my own manipulation, I might as well use it. I've been a fool suppressing my predatory instincts. Time to take what's mine. Trust is for the weak. Now that I understand the game, I'll play to win. This isn't integration, it's shadow possession. You've gone from rejecting the shadow to being consumed by it. The psychological mechanism. When you first encounter your shadow after years or decades of rejection, the recognition can feel intoxicating. All that power, all that capability you'd been denying, suddenly available. The ego, desperate for stability after the dissolution that shadow recognition brings, sometimes grabs onto the shadow as a new identity. This is the real me, the one I've been suppressing all along. But Jung warned, this is just another defense. Against wholeness, you've traded one fragment, the defended victim, for another fragment, the ruthless predator. Real case. Example: David came to Jungian analysis as a classic wounded sage, intellectually cynical, unable to trust, convinced everyone operated from pure self-interest. Through shadow work, he recognized his own rejected capacity for strategic manipulation. He'd been projecting this onto everyone while secretly using it himself, but calling it necessary survival. The recognition should have led to integration. I have these capacities and I can choose when and how to use them ethically. Instead, David inflated into his shadow. He left therapy convinced he'd woken up to reality, started treating his family with open contempt, deliberately manipulated colleagues for advancement, and justified it all as finally being honest about human nature. Within a year, he'd destroyed his marriage, alienated his children, and isolated himself more profoundly than before his shadow work began, except now he wore it as a badge of honor rather than hidden shame. The warning signs. You know you're in shadow inflation when you feel morally superior to your naive previous self. You justify harmful behavior as just being real. You experience a manic quality, excessive energy, grandiosity, feeling like you've discovered a secret others don't know. You lose empathy for others' vulnerabilities. People who care about you express concern that you've changed in a scary way. The correction. Real integration maintains the tension between opposites. You own your capacity for manipulation and your capacity for genuine care. You acknowledge your predatory instincts and your protective instincts. Jung called this holding the tension of opposites, refusing to collapse into either pole. If you notice shadow inflation beginning, pause all shadow work temporarily and focus instead on reconnecting with the qualities you valued before recognition: care, compassion, connection, ethics. Integration isn't choosing one side, it's encompassing both. Pitfall 2. Spiritual bypassing through radical trust, premature integration. This trap involves leaping over shadow work entirely by forcing yourself to just trust before you've actually integrated your projections. What it looks like. You recognize you have trust wounds and decide to fix them through willpower and positive thinking. I'm just going to choose to trust people. I'm going to be radically open and vulnerable with everyone. I won't let my past trauma control me. I'm going to assume the best about everyone. This feels spiritual, evolved, healing, but it's actually avoidance, skipping the hard work of shadow integration by jumping to the endpoint without the necessary process. The psychological mechanism. Your ego is brilliant at finding sophisticated ways to avoid shadow confrontation. One method is spiritual bypass, using spiritual or psychological concepts to avoid uncomfortable inner work. Radical trust sounds healthy, but if it hasn't emerged from genuine integration, it's just another defense. You're forcing yourself to override your admittedly distorted instincts rather than transforming them. Real case example. Emma entered shadow work after recognizing her fortress guardian pattern had isolated her for decades, but the actual shadow integration work, acknowledging her own capacity for betrayal, her rejected neediness, her strategic withdrawal, felt too painful, so she bypassed it. She attended workshops on opening the heart and choosing trust. She forced herself into vulnerable situations before doing the integration work. She started dating someone she barely knew and immediately disclosed deep traumas. She invested money in a business partnership without due diligence, calling it trusting the universe. She ignored red flags in relationships, labeling her appropriate concerns as just my trauma talking. The result was predictable. She got hurt repeatedly. Each betrayal confirmed that her original distrust was correct, driving her back into defensive isolation, but now with an added layer of shame about her failed healing. The warning signs. You know you're spiritually bypassing when you're forcing trust through willpower rather than experiencing it naturally. You label appropriate discernment as fear or trauma response. You ignore red flags to prove you're healed. You feel virtuous about trusting but anxious underneath. You're acting vulnerable without actually feeling safe. The correction. Real trust emerges from integration, not force. You can't skip to the destination without walking the path. If you recognize this pattern, stop forcing trust and return to the actual shadow work, acknowledging your own capacity for betrayal, manipulation, and harm. Integration of these shadow elements is what creates genuine discernment, which includes both appropriate trust and appropriate caution. The goal isn't to become radically trusting, it's to become genuinely discerning. trusting when warranted, cautious when needed, based on conscious assessment rather than unconscious projection. Pitfall 3. Analysis paralysis, intellectual defense. This pitfall involves turning shadow work itself into another defensive fortress, understanding everything intellectually while changing nothing experientially. What it looks like. You read everything Jung wrote. You can articulate shadow projection theory brilliantly. You analyze your patterns with sophisticated precision. You have insights about your trust wound in every therapy session, but your life doesn't change. Your relationships remain stuck. Your nervous system stays hyper-vigilant. You still can't trust. The psychological mechanism. The ego is so sophisticated that it can use psychological understanding itself as a defense against transformation. If you can intellectually understand your shadow, you create the illusion of mastery without the vulnerability of actual integration. You stay in your head rather than dropping into your body and emotions where real change happens. Jung warned extensively about this. One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. Thinking about your shadow isn't the same as integrating it. Talking about your projections isn't the same as stopping them. Real case. Example: Thomas spent 5 years in Jungian analysis. He could discuss his shadow projections eloquently. He'd identified his patterns, named his archetypes, understood his defenses intellectually, but in his actual life, nothing shifted. He still tested his partner constantly. He still surveilled colleagues. He still withdrew from connection at the first sign of vulnerability. When confronted about this gap, Thomas would generate more analysis. Yes, I see how my intellectual defense is itself a shadow manifestation of my need for control. He'd turned therapy into an intellectual exercise rather than a transformative process. The analysis itself had become the defense. The warning signs. You know you're in analysis paralysis when you can explain your patterns perfectly, but don't change them. You use psychological jargon to describe your behavior without modifying it. You intellectually understand your shadow, but don't emotionally integrate it. You feel proud of your self-awareness, but your relationships remain stuck. You're more interested in understanding why you do something than in stopping or transforming it. The correction, integration, requires embodiment, not just understanding. If you recognize this pattern, stop reading and analyzing temporarily. Stop generating insights. Focus exclusively on the practical tools, active imagination, the mirror confrontation, the opposite day practice, anything that gets you out of your head and into direct experience. Jung was clear. The shoe that fits one person pinches another. There is no recipe for living that suits all cases. Translation: stop looking for the perfect intellectual framework and start doing the uncomfortable experiential work that your specific psyche needs. Pitfall 4. The persecution flip, shadow shame spiral. This pitfall involves redirecting all your projection energy inward, attacking yourself with the same paranoid intensity you formerly directed at others. What it looks like. Through shadow work, you recognize all the ways you've projected onto others. You see the harm you've caused through testing, surveillance, and distrust. But instead of compassionate integration, you flip into self-persecution. I'm terrible. I've destroyed every relationship. I'm the untrustworthy one. I'm manipulative, dishonest, cruel. I don't deserve connection. You've taken the judge and executioner archetypes you'd been projecting onto others and turned them on yourself at maximum intensity. The psychological mechanism. Jung identified this as one of the most heartbreaking pitfalls because it emerges from genuine recognition but gets distorted by the same projection mechanism that created the original problem. You correctly identify that you've been projecting, but instead of integrating the shadow with compassion, You judge yourself for having a shadow at all, which is just another form of shadow rejection. You're still in the same pattern, rejection of human complexity. But now the target is yourself instead of others. Real case. Example: Sophia entered shadow work and had profound recognition of her testmaster pattern. She saw clearly how she'd made connection impossible through constant loyalty tests, how she'd pushed away genuine love through suspicion. But instead of compassionate integration, she collapsed into self-hatred. Her journal entries became brutal self-prosecutions. I'm a monster. I destroyed partner's name with my paranoia. I don't deserve another chance. Everyone was right to leave me. She withdrew from all relationships now, not because she didn't trust others, but because she believed she was too damaged and harmful to inflict herself on anyone. The trust wound had inverted but remained structurally identical. Instead of "no one can be trusted," it became "I can't be trusted." The warning signs: you know you're in the persecution flip when your shadow recognition leads to self-hatred rather than self-compassion. You believe you're fundamentally damaged or evil for having shadow material. You withdraw from connection to protect others from you. You ruminate obsessively about past relationship failures with yourself as villain. You feel you don't deserve healing or happiness because of your projections. The correction: Jung's framework requires radical self-compassion. Everyone has shadow material. Every human being is capable of betrayal, manipulation, harm. This doesn't make us evil, it makes us human. If you notice the persecution flip, practice the phrase, "I am a complete human being," which means I contain all human capacities, including ones I've rejected. This is normal, not monstrous. Remember, the goal of shadow work isn't to prove you're bad. It's to prove you're whole, which includes both light and dark. Treat yourself as you would a beloved friend doing this difficult work, with compassion, patience, and celebration of every step forward. Pitfall 5. Premature reconciliation. Confusing shadow work with condoning harm. The final major pitfall involves misunderstanding integration as requiring you to reconcile with people who genuinely harmed you. What it looks like: you do shadow work and recognize you've been projecting. You understand that your distrust often revealed more about you than about others. Then you misapply this insight. If I was projecting, then maybe they didn't actually betray me. Maybe I need to go back and try to trust them again. You attempt reconciliation with people who are actually untrustworthy, confusing shadow integration with naive forgiveness. The psychological mechanism: this pitfall emerges from a misunderstanding of Jung's framework. Shadow integration doesn't mean everyone was actually trustworthy all along. It means your emotional intensity and global distrust were disproportionate because of projection. But some people genuinely do betray, manipulate, and harm others. Shadow work helps you distinguish between real threats and projected ones. It doesn't mean all threats were imaginary. Real case. Example: after months of shadow work, Michael recognized his hypervigilant protector pattern. He'd been seeing predators everywhere because he had rejected his own predatory instincts. But then he misapplied this insight. He reached out to his ex-business partner who had actually embezzled money from their company, thinking, maybe I was just projecting my own dishonesty onto him. Maybe I should give him another chance. The partner was delighted to re-engage and promptly exploited Michael again. Michael's shadow work was genuine, but he'd confused "I've been projecting" with "therefore everyone I suspected was actually innocent." The warning signs: you know you're in premature reconciliation when you question your memory of actual harmful events. You feel guilty for maintaining boundaries with people who demonstrated untrustworthiness. You think shadow work requires trusting everyone equally, You override legitimate concerns as just my projection. The correction. Integration creates discernment, not universal trust. After shadow work, you should be better at distinguishing between projected threat, someone who triggered your wound but didn't actually betray you. You saw your shadow in them. Real threat, someone whose behavior demonstrated genuine untrustworthiness through patterns of deception, manipulation, or harm. Shadow work helps you see the first category clearly, so you can respond appropriately to the second. You don't need to trust everyone to be integrated. You need to trust appropriate people in appropriate contexts and protect yourself wisely from those who've proven untrustworthy through actions, not just feelings. Jung himself maintained strong boundaries with certain people throughout his life. Integration gave him clarity about who merited trust and who didn't, based on conscious assessment rather than unconscious projection.